A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I have to keep this brief because I don't know how much time I have left. Something is crawling under my skin, the gnawing feeling that whatever I saw last night has awakened an entity lurking within the shadows of my house. You remember the last post, right? No sleep. I saw our dog walking on two legs last night. He went into my sister's room and now she's gone. It felt absurd to write that, but then again, nothing felt real anymore. The day after my sister disappeared, I did everything to act normal at school, a mask of casualness that couldn't hide the frantic beating of my heart or the terror that clung to my ribs. We didn't even have the comfort of dogs barking or scratching at the door to disturb the silence. Our house became a mausoleum echoing memories. Whatever had happened in my sister's room still felt revoltingly fresh, like regurgitated food sitting in the back of my throat. My parents were beside themselves, scouring the house for clues but refusing to admit that something supernatural could have stolen her away. They asked me questions, their eyes narrowing at me with suspicion as if I somehow had an answer, but how could I explain something so monstrous? I stayed away from the deepening shadows, the corners of the hallway where I first glimpsed Milo, our golden retriever, moving like a man, tall and lithe, its body twisting in ways no creature should. It didn't bark or whimper, it simply paused, those haunting eyes narrowed as if it were gazing right through me. I wanted to call for my sister, Jennifer, to show her the cruel trick reality was playing on me, but a shard of fear wedged itself in my throat. It felt wrong. When I finally gathered the courage to find her, the door to her room stood ajar, an ominous black void contrasting the bright afternoon light. I peered inside, a jolt of horror rushing through me as I found her bed perfectly made, her favorite plush bear, Mr. Wiggles, sitting up on the pillow looking as if waiting for her return. My sister was obsessed with that bear, they had been inseparable since she was a toddler. Every single one of Jennifer's belongings remained untouched, her clothes draped over the chair like a silent scream, but she was nowhere to be found. I searched the entire house, our once safe haven now felt like a treacherous labyrinth closing in on me. That's when I heard it, the faintest of whispers, luring me back to her room. As if compelled by some invisible hand, I stepped inside again, the door creaking ominously behind me. My blood ran cold as I felt the air shift, heavy with something thick and suffocating. Something was wrong. I followed the whispers, quiet, melodic, calling for help. "Jenny?" I strained to listen, it was definitely her voice, and it seemed to radiate from the depths of the closet. Slowly, I crouched down, holding my breath as I turned the knob. The whispering escalated, growing louder. "Help me! Help me!" Chills raced up my spine as I threw open the closet door, anticipating to see her curled up, just scared or maybe hiding from a game. Instead, the darkness inside nested tight like an eager predator. The whisper ceased instantly, replaced by an oppressive silence. My heart hammered painfully against my chest. Just as I was about to step back, I caught a glimpse of something shifting in the corner of my eye. It was Milo, eerily still and watching, his head cocked slightly to the side, almost as if he was trying to understand me. I backed out of the closet, but before I could bolt, Milo padded toward me, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor in a slow rhythm, a heartbeat of ominous purpose. I was paralyzed by a wave of dread as I found my voice, croaking, "Where is she?" In response, Milo stood on his hind legs, as he had before, his spine elongating until he appeared almost human-like in stature. He stared down at me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. Then he turned toward the closet and a guttural growl broke the silence, something so primal that it vibrated through the air. The closet door slammed shut on its own, rattling the facade of what remained of my sanity. I fled outside, desperate for fresh air, for light, but what I found was a suffocating haze closing around the house, a mirage of shadows gathering behind the windows, the darkened silhouettes pressing against the glass, masking everything behind them. Then I heard it, Jennifer's scream pierced through the hush, and for the first time, I realized those shadows were not simply cast by the darkness but were sentient beings. Crying out, I rushed back, feeling the weight of their predatory glee. Driven by instinct, I stumbled through every room, calling out for my sister, desperately hoping to reach her where I didn't know she was trapped. That's when I saw it again, Milo, appearing to gather more shadows closer, and I saw her, fleeting behind him. The agonizing twist of her face turned in desperation as the creature pulled her back, the golden fur engulfed her within a darkness that devoured everything. "Help me! Please," she cried, but Milo's eyes, those deep, hollow sockets, promised that he would take her far away, somewhere unreachable. I screamed, clawing at the door as they slipped from my grasp, feeling the life inside of me drain. It wasn't my sister anymore, though. It was something else, a warped reflection of the girl I knew, twisted by whatever had taken her. The shadows shrank back as the door slammed shut and the growing cacophony of whispers grew quieter, the lullaby of lost souls. I don't know how it happened, but now I'm here, writing this, continuously peeking into the corners of my house for fear that they'll return. Today, I've realized one terrifying truth: it's only a matter of time before they come for me, and when they do, I'll be just like Milo, walking on two legs into the shadows, searching for something to consume. I've always prided myself on being the kind of person who does right by others. I've donated to charity, volunteered at animal shelters, mentored kids from underprivileged backgrounds, you name it, I've done it. For years, I wore this goodness like a badge of honor, thinking it was all that mattered. But I've recently had a disturbing revelation, one that's shaken me to my core. I'm a good person, yes, but I'm not a nice person. This might sound like semantics, but let me explain. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday when a knock on my front door interrupted my evening routine. The face behind the peephole was unfamiliar, yet there was something unsettling about the man's eyes. They glinted with a strange intensity, as if harboring a secret they intended to share whether I liked it or not. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. His presence was disarming, not for any overt threat, but because of his calm insistence that he had something important to say to me. "You've always thought of yourself as someone who does the right thing," he began, his voice almost hypnotic in its evenness, "but you've never considered the cost of that goodness." I should have shut the door in his face, but something about his words stopped me cold. He went on to recount incidents from my life, things only I could know. He talked about the time I had called out a colleague for plagiarism, a good deed that had effectively ruined her career. He reminded me of the protest I had organized against a local business for unethical practices, a campaign that had led to layoffs and financial hardship for dozens of employees. Finally, he mentioned my decision to step in when a friend was having marital issues. My interference, though well-intentioned, had resulted in an ugly divorce. I felt a growing nausea in my gut as he unearthed these memories. I had never stopped to consider the collateral damage of my actions. The man called what I did good but not nice, and that distinction was tearing me apart. Was it possible to be morally right yet utterly lacking in empathy? As horrifying as it was to admit, I couldn't deny the truth of what he said. My goodness had been weaponized, wielded like a blunt instrument with no regard for the casualties left in its wake. I asked him why he came to tell me this, and he simply smiled, a chilling expression devoid of warmth. "Because it's time you faced it," he said. With that cryptic statement, he turned and walked away, leaving me to stew in a swamp of doubt and self-loathing. I tried to forget his visit, but his words clung to my thoughts like a stubborn echo. My life, once a tapestry of pride and accomplishment, now seemed more akin to a patchwork of unintended harm. In my pursuit of integrity, I realized I had strayed from kindness, a realization forcing me to confront the shadows of my own conscience. The weight of it was suffocating, and for the first time, I questioned my own moral compass. Were my motivations ever truly selfless, or were they driven by a need for validation? I found myself avoiding interactions, fearful of the damage my good intentions might inflict. Paradoxically, my newfound awareness freed me from the illusion of moral superiority and shackled me with the burden of doubt. However, this internal crisis birthed a change, a resolve to listen first, act later. As weeks turned into months, I learned to embrace the chaos of others' lives without imposing my sanctimonious judgments. Though the path was fraught with challenges, I realized the true hell wasn't in being a bad person, but in being good without being nice. That anonymous visitor had been a catalyst, a haunting enigma that empowered me to redefine my humanity. Perhaps I'll never know who he was or why he chose me, but one thing is certain: he changed my life. Now, whenever I reflect on my actions, I carry with me the nagging reminder of what it means to be good and why it's more important, albeit harder, to be nice. It all started on a Friday night when my best friend Ethan and I decided to go camping in an area that we'd heard whispered about in online forums, an expanse of wilderness known for strange sightings and an unsettling energy, but the thrill of the unknown was too luring to resist. Armed with flashlights, a couple of hot dogs, and a cheap tent, we set off into the thickening woods, joking and laughing as we made our way deeper into the trees, shaking off the gnawing feeling that we were being watched. A few hours in, as we sat by our small campfire toasting marshmallows, we decided to swap ghost stories, and I felt a chill creep over me as Ethan recounted a tale about locals spotting a creature with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. I laughed it off, but the thought clung to my mind like a burr. Around midnight, while we were still wide awake, We heard rustling in the underbrush, our laughter died, and the thrill of our first night in the wild turned to dread as a low, guttural growl resonated from the darkness, sending shocks down my spine. I insisted it was just a deer, but Ethan wasn't convinced and urged me to hush. The growl came again, closer this time, and the air seemed to thicken around us as we exchanged terrified glances, our bravado evaporating like the smoke from our fire. The forest transformed into an intricate maze of shadows, and every snap of a twig felt magnified, echoing our collective heartbeat as we sat huddled by the flames, wondering if we had disturbed something best left alone. Just as we decided to retreat into the tent, something lunged out from the darkness beyond the firelight, a massive shadow darting on all fours. It moved with a fluidity that wasn't natural, and the moon overhead caught a glimpse of something jagged and humanoid, though its form was utterly wrong. We scrambled back, hearts racing, as it dashed back into the cover of the trees, leaving a chilling silence in its wake, our bravado reduced to hushed whispers about what just happened. Ethan wanted to pack up and go home, but part of me was still consumed with curiosity. What if this figure was just an animal, an oversized raccoon perhaps? My bravery faltered, but I calmed Ethan down, assuring him it couldn't be anything too dangerous. As the night wore on, our restlessness turned to reckless thinking. Foolishly, we decided to investigate, fueled by adrenaline and curiosity. Armed with our phones' flashlights, we ventured into the darkness beyond the firelight, leaving the warm crackle of the flames behind for the biting chill of the night. We called out, taunting whatever lurked in the periphery, daring it to show itself. Our voices reverberated through the trees until an unearthly howl shattered the stillness, a wail that felt primal, almost angry, and froze us in our tracks. The ground shook as we heard branches snap, and a swift movement flitted through the thicket, leading me to believe it wasn't all in our heads after all. Panic surged, but we pressed on, certain this was the moment we'd finally catch a glimpse of the cryptid lurking in the shadows, driving us deeper into the thick brush, where the trees seemed to whisper our names. We climbed a small rise, the forest enveloping us, and then we saw it, a glimmering pair of eyes staring at us from a distance, bright against the velvet blackness. Time slowed as we stood frozen. There was no denying what was before us, a creature smeared with darkness, almost humanoid but grotesquely contorted, its arms too long, its legs bent in unnatural angles. It tilted its head, detecting our presence, and in that moment, I felt my breath seize as fear overtook me. Together, we backed away slowly, not daring to turn our backs until a soft, almost melodic whisper emanated from the creature, luring us in. I clutched Ethan's arm, desperately trying to pull him away as fear sank its teeth deeper into my heart. We made a break for it. Every snap of a twig beneath our feet felt like thunder as we raced back to the tent, a sinister sense of urgency pushing us forward while the thought of what we had seen clawed at the back of my mind. I can still remember the way the moonlight spilled through the trees, revealing flashes of it following closely behind but never close enough to catch us. Once we dove into the tent, we frantically zipped it shut, our hearts pounding in unison as we listened to the chaos erupting outside. It circled our camp, growling and scratching at the fabric of our tent, sending my mind spiraling into raw panic. Ethan whispered that we needed to stay still and quiet, but all I could think about was the monster that had shown itself and what it might do if it broke in. The scratching finally faded, but the howls continued, echoing that eerie melody throughout the night as we held each other in a close embrace, clinging to the hope that the dawn would save us. As the sun broke the horizon, the howls ceased, and we emerged cautiously, breathless with horror, discovering multiple deep gouges in the earth where the creature had prowled. Our campfire lay smoldering, but the fear lingered in the air thick as a fog. As soon as we packed our things, trying to shake off the terrible memories and convince each other that we were both okay, we didn't speak of it again, just hurried back down the path like frightened children. But my curiosity still nagged at me, the need for closure remained, and weeks later, when Ethan backed away from the conversation as if it had never happened, I embarked on a different kind of adventure, poring over research into legends and folklore around the area. What I found shook me. Reports of an entity whispered of in fragments, an ancient being that lured the unwary deep into the woods, tales of shadowy figures that led lost souls astray, stories of eyes in the dark. I tuned into forums of those who had disappeared in that vicinity and read experiences eerily similar to our own, coupled with the knowledge that some who ventured into the depths never returned at all. After nights of restless digging, I decided I needed to return, dragging Ethan back into those woods. But when I mentioned it, he turned as pale as ash, murmuring that some things are better left undisturbed. Desperation crept in as I tried to convince him it was just paranoia, yet even I felt the weight of something closely watching even still. We argued, I couldn't let it go. I needed answers, but deep down, I feared my pursuit might lead us back into that nightmare. Now, I'm left here, alone in the dark, writing this down, every detail lingering in my mind, hoping that someone out there can help make sense of it all. Did we experience a cryptid? Did we unleash something that night? If you find yourselves in those woods, even in the light, remember my warning: don't follow the whispers, the forest speaks the truth, and not all who venture in ever come out the same. I've been worried sick ever since my wife, Emily, left to check out a new listing for the real estate agency she works with. When she hurried out the door that morning, I could sense her excitement. It was a historic, isolated mansion that had just come on the market, the kind of place with grand staircases and rumors of secret passageways. It was her dream gig, but something gnawed at me as she waved goodbye. That gnaw turned into dread when I didn't hear from her by evening. Calls went straight to voicemail, and texts remained unread. By the time the sunset turned into an eerie glow over the landscape, I knew I had to go check on her. Grabbing my keys, I headed out, trying to convince myself that she'd just lost track of time in the labyrinthine corridors of an old house. The drive felt interminable, the lonelier roads lined with dense trees closing in like claustrophobic walls. When I finally arrived, the bone-chilling wind and sound of the wrought iron gates creaking open set my heart thrumming in my chest. There it stood, an imposing structure looming out of the darkness, almost daring me to enter. The windows appeared like soulless eyes, staring down at me as if they knew something I didn't. A shiver coursed through me. It felt like the atmosphere itself was warning me to stay away. Inside, the air was cold and stale, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. I called out her name, my voice echoing against the high ceilings. No answer. I found her car in the driveway, yet everything inside the mansion was dark, silent. Floors creaked beneath my weight with each hesitant step, and with the fading daylight seeping through the window, I could barely make out the dusty furniture draped in sheets. Remnants of a life once vibrant and now forgotten. I checked my phone again, just in case, hoping for a signal that refused to cooperate. My heart pounded louder than my footsteps as I moved deeper into the house, calling her name again, the syllables swallowed by the shadowy walls. My imagination started playing tricks, shadows moving just beyond my vision, a distant murmur almost like whispers taunting me from behind shut doors. 10 minutes felt like hours as I explored room after room, each more unnerving than the last. And then, turning a corner, I stumbled into what seemed to be an ornate study, a fireplace looming and cold. There, on the dusty floor, lay her phone, screen cracked. The sight wrenched my gut, panic rising with each breath. Had she been in danger? As I pocketed the phone, I heard a noise. A muffled sob? I froze, listening, straining to determine its source. It led me to a narrow, almost hidden door, tucked behind a large bookshelf. Pushing it open, I found a small spiral staircase, descending into the earth like a helix into the abyss. Trembling, I descended, the air growing colder with each step. The sobbing grew louder, echoing up the spiral like a harrowing lament. At the base, there was a darkened room, damp and smelling of mildew. And there she was, Emily, hunched and shaking, her ankle caught in a rusted trap's iron teeth. Relief flooded through me, followed by horror at her condition. Quickly, I rushed to her side, tears in both our eyes as I comforted her and unlatched the old trap. Her whispered words were frenetic and jumbled, a tale of ghostly encounters, shadow figures that emerged from the walls as if the house itself were alive, rejecting her presence. She described how doors had closed on their own, and voices had coaxed her into this bitter undercroft where the trap had ensnared her in her panic. With her arm around my shoulder, we hurried up the stairs. Every sound in that house felt magnified, each creak a threat, each gust of wind a disembodied warning. Once outside, we dared not look back, the gravel crunching beneath our desperate footsteps as we returned to the car. Safe within the confines of the driver's seat, it dawned on me how close we had come to being consumed by whatever ancient menace lay coiled within those walls. Emily, still shivering, rested her head against the window, whispering she'd never set foot in an old house again. We've tried to forget about that day, but every so often, something reminds us, a chill when the wind blows just right, or the way shadows sometimes bend in a hallway, and we remember the house that didn't want us to leave. We never did find out who set the trap or if the ghosts were real, but it's enough to know that some places hold secrets better left unexplored. It all started when I found a penny on the ground outside a rundown convenience store, one of those places you wouldn't typically enter unless absolutely necessary. The penny was unnaturally shiny, so bright it almost looked new, but it was definitely a penny, and I made a wish out of habit, thinking about how my grandmother always said a penny could bring you luck if you found it heads up. I tossed it into my pocket and forgot about it until the next morning, when I woke up to an unexpected text informing me I'd won a small lottery prize. Even better, it was a ticket I'd bought on a whim the day before, and before I could even process my luck, things just kept getting better. The very next week, I found another penny, this one equally lustrous, and without thinking twice, I wished again. Again. I ended up winning something, the job promotion I'd been chasing for years, a leap in my career that had seemed impossible only days before. Over the next month, I kept finding these otherworldly pennies, one after another, each more astonishing than the last. I bought a new car, went on luxurious trips, and felt the thrill of prosperity dancing in my bones. It was like a dream, until it wasn't. The last penny I found was dropped just as I left a bustling cafe, unsettling as it seemed to roll away from my foot before abruptly stopping. I picked it up eagerly, wishing for my luck to continue, convinced I was on this golden path, but the moment I pocketed that penny, things soured. My promotion turned into a nightmare week of horrible, disastrous meetings that culminated in a scathing performance review. Then, I got a call that my sister had been in a car accident. Thankfully, she survived, but the emotional toll was overwhelming. I numbly tried to find comfort again in my shiny, cursed pennies, repeating the ritual, each time making a new wish, but the more I wished on those pennies, the darker the world around me became. I started noticing shadows that seemed to flicker and fade at the edges of my vision, but when I turned my head, they'd vanish, and every time I opened my wallet, the pennies shone all the brighter, the weight of them in my pocket almost tangible with an energy that felt wrong. A week later, I found myself in line at a supermarket when the cashier's voice dropped, and I instantly felt it, an oppressive fear lurking behind me. A man stood there, his presence suffocating, but when I turned around, he vanished, as if he had never been there at all. When I got home, I noticed that every single penny I'd collected was now blackened and tarnished, as if a dark stain had spread over their once bright surfaces. My dreams shifted from visions of money and success to nightmares of grotesque figures lurking in the shadows, whispering my name, echoing with a sinister promise as their faces twisted in mockery. My fortune had deteriorated into horror. As the days crawled on, I felt increasingly hunted, as if something was attaching itself to me through these so-called lucky charms. I tried to rid myself of them, tossing the pennies into the river, but the next morning, they'd somehow returned, glimmering under my bed, beckoning me back into their dark embrace. That's when I reached my breaking point. I decided to confront my luck directly and went back to the convenience store where it had all begun, demanding answers from the clerk, who only looked at me with hollow eyes, recognizing too late that I was not the first to come looking for help. He revealed that there was a curse woven into every penny: the more you use them for your greed, the more they preyed on your spirit. I realized with chilling horror that the wish I had made for prosperity had opened a gateway for something dark and insatiable, a force that fed off my desires. Alone in my apartment, those shriveled pennies taunted me mercilessly, reflections of everything I had lost, haunts that represented all my misbegotten wishes. I hatched a desperate plan to excise my mistake, gathering the cursed coins in a bag and heading out under the cover of night to a cemetery far away from my home, hoping to bury them in the earth, the only thing that could possibly rid me of the weight I was carrying. As I dug into the soil, tossing the coins into the pit, I felt a heavy presence grow palpable behind me, but I didn't dare look back until I was finished. The moment I turned, there he was, the man from the store, his face now twisted into a grotesque mask of fury. Realizing far too late that the coins must have demanded a sacrifice, my body froze in dread as his voice rumbled like an earthquake, claiming my soul as the final payment for the fine glimmer of promises betrayed. Pennies went from lucky to my worst nightmare, and as I felt myself being dragged into darkness, I wondered if somewhere out there was another hopeful soul who'd unknowingly inherit my cursed fate, and all I could do was whisper a warning as I slipped into the abyss: some luck is better left unfound. When I first started working as a hospital janitor right out of high school, I had no idea how low my paycheck would be compared to the horrifying sacrifices I would eventually make. I remember the first day vividly. The fluorescent lights flickered above as I donned my oversized uniform, a scent of sterile cleaning agents swirling in the air, and the echo of distant beeping machines punctuating the silence. Nurses and doctors passed by incessantly, faces masked in concentrated determination, oblivious to the scruffy figure behind them. It didn't take long for me to understand that the job was more than just mopping floors and emptying bins. Instead, it was an endless loop of exposure to the dark, unnerving realities hidden beneath the sterile facade of the hospital. As weeks turned to months, I became entangled in the hushed whispers of the patients, stories I couldn't unhear despite how hard I tried. The cries of the dying seeped through the walls, telling tales of despair and lost chances. I recall one chilling night shift when I heard a woman sobbing in room 303, a soft, broken sound grinding against the starkness of the operating room, announcements constantly echoing. My curiosity eventually pulled me closer to her plight. Later, I found out her name was Claire, suffering from terminal cancer, and while I was tasked with simply cleaning her room, I began to listen to her stories of love, regret, and pain as each night I returned to scrub the gleaming floors of her brave, fragile existence. Then one fateful night, I entered her room to find it eerily silent, the bed empty, the sheets freshly laundered, and the shadows deepening in the corners as if they were conspiring to steal her soul. I felt unsettled, yet a sense of duty compelled me to keep cleaning, even as I sensed a heaviness in the air, an electromagnetic pulse of sorrow radiating from the room. Just as I pushed the mop through streaks of disinfectant, I heard a soft whisper, "Help me." It stopped me cold. I scanned the room, my heart pounding wildly, only to discover the chilling connection with the chair in the corner, a woman, pale as death, dressed in what looked like a hospital gown, her face as hollow as the memories she carried. "Help me find my son," she implored, her voice like autumn wind rustling through dead leaves. I glanced back at the door, paralyzed by both fear and sympathy. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching infinitely. I didn't know what to do, duty and dread battling within me like thunderous storms, but the look in her eyes compelled me, something primal weaving around my heart. I answered her with a hesitant nod, and it was then she smiled, a fractured thing, before fading like smoke into the darkness. In the subsequent weeks, the haunting whispers persisted. Claire's story morphed into something all-consuming as I scoured the hospital for signs of her son, but all I unraveled were more lost souls, tragic narratives entwined with every corner I cleaned. Each day, I grew more exhausted, not just physically, but psychologically. My fellow janitors joked about our conditions, the long hours, paltry wages, and the shadows that seemed to surround us. They shrugged it off, but I knew we bore secrets buried beneath the dirty linoleum and sterile tiles, secrets that demanded acknowledgement. The admin was tight-lipped about the realms we navigated, and though I considered reporting the overwhelming sensations, the hushed dismissals made me second-guess. But I pressed on, feeling the weight of those who had drifted into the night, their stories shifting into mine. Searching resulted in dark, endless nights. A particularly haunting corridor would open into room 305, where another tormented soul lay, and I promised I'd help him too. Some nights began to blend into the next as the dying pleas throbbed in my ears like echoes bouncing off time. Time lost its meaning, and the meager paycheck only deepened my discontent. I had no formal training, just a mop and a hazy resolve to unearth the unworldly connections that tethered these spirits in pain. Then one morning, just as I was finishing a shift, Claire's silhouette danced before me again, a flicker in the farthest corner of my vision. My heart raced, her son, as though she had linked our souls in an eternal prayer. "You're too late," she whispered breathlessly. Too late to help him. Frantic, I darted down the corridor, a battle cry of urgency exploding in my chest. Every heartbeat pounded in rhythm with each labored step toward room 305, but the thick dread clawing at my gut felt insurmountable. Just as I arrived, I found the door ajar, the familiar chilled air almost welcoming me as I stepped closer. Shadows flickered against the walls like ominous warnings. But the room was empty, a haunting silence hanging in the air like forgotten dreams. Succumbing to a moment's weakness, I sank to my knees, the magnitude of failure pressing down on my shoulders like a shroud, and it was then I heard her voice again, now sharper, like glass cutting through fog. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun to face the source. The last thing I expected was to find the ghostly visage of Claire materializing like dark mist, a hollow echo of her former self, and I realized, the boy had never existed. I had been drawn into a web of sorrow, helplessly ensnared by the unending cycle of despair. As darkness enveloped me, the cold, clammy air pinched at my skin, her presence disappearing before I could plead for understanding. I shot back into consciousness, the whispers now relentless and maddening, and I quit that night, vowing never to return, resigned to the fact that my meager pay wasn't enough for the souls I had failed. But as weeks rolled by and I sought new work, I still felt their presence, the keen gaze of wandering eyes trailing me, forever searching for solace. Making just enough to scrape by felt like another loss, and gradually my soul chipped away, a reminder of the grim price for such an unappreciated role in life's theater. And now, as I tell my truth to you, I brace for the waking nightmare where the souls of the forgotten reach out with cold fingers, the weight of their stories compressing my heart as it beats like a drum only I can hear, wrapped in the pain of the one thing no amount of money can ever rectify, listening too deeply to the dangers of their ceaseless longing. As I stepped into my small clinic for another long day, the familiar sounds of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead filled the air, but today felt different. There was an unmistakable tension coiling in my gut, even as I glanced through my schedule and saw a new patient listed under the mysterious name St. Michael. My mind chuckled ironically at the coincidence, dismissing it as a quirky name like so many others I'd encountered, until I met him. When he walked through the door, he radiated an uncanny glow. It was almost as if the shadows dared not touch him, and the very air around him seemed to shimmer with a warmth that disarmed me instantly. He smiled, and there was something in his eyes, a depth that felt overwhelming, as if he'd lived 1,000 lifetimes. My skepticism faded as he took a seat, and with each seemingly simple question he answered, I saw traces of profound wisdom that belied his age. As I went through the motions of taking his medical history, I felt an odd sense of euphoria wash over me. He shared stories of helping the homeless, volunteering at shelters, sometimes reaching into his own pockets to feed hungry children. It was also admirable that it almost felt surreal. This was no ordinary patient. But as the session progressed, I started noticing things that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. In between transitions from his past achievements, each time I looked away, I'd hear whispers echoing around the room, soft and ethereal, just beyond the realm of comprehension, like the sighs of distant souls begging for release. I tried to shake it off, attributing it to fatigue, but the whispers grew louder with every word he spoke, entwining themselves with his tales of kindness until I could no longer distinguish reality from imagination. One particular point made me fixate on him even more. He casually mentioned a tragic car accident, the details creeping into my mind like shadows reaching out to drag me into a deeper abyss. It's not the hardware you lose that matters, it's the souls you carry, he said, his voice oddly comforting, yet those words chilled me to the bone. Suddenly, the playful skepticism I had felt transformed into a foreboding dread, especially when I realized I had forgotten to adhere to HIPAA regulations. I found myself sharing poignant details of my own life, my struggles with addiction and loneliness, and when I finished, his gaze felt disturbingly penetrating. He nodded knowingly, like a listener from beyond the grave, and I could feel an insatiable urge to unearth more truths from him, as if he was the key to unraveling a hidden part of myself. Day after day, our sessions continued. Each time he arrived, the glow around him brightened, contrasting with my growing darkness, a fact that became more apparent when I started finding little tokens left behind after his visits, a feather now perched on my desk, a vibrant flower on the floor where he sat, and even a handwritten note left under my coffee mug, all bearing simple but profound wisdom. I found myself obsessively searching online about the phenomena of halos and blinding lights, convinced that he could be something otherworldly, maybe even an angel sent to guide lost souls like mine, but I was also deeply disturbed. Why would an angel need a healthcare provider, and more critically, why did he need me? One evening, bolstered by sinking confessions to my therapist who took pity on my fragile mind, I decided to confront this Saint Michael about what I felt. A mental health professional second-guessing his own sanity was already dangerous, and I dreaded the potential fallout if I went rogue. I waited in my office, heart pounding like a war drum, ultimately drawing courage from the shadows of the very room I wished to escape. The door creaked open, and a figure emerged with a soft light radiating all around, but as he stepped closer, what I saw sent me reeling. His face was the definition of serenity, yet the deeper I gazed, the more I recognized the eyes that stared back at me. They were the same eyes of every patient I lost, their haunting memories melting together into a grotesque tapestry of guilt clinging to my conscience. My hands began to shake as the whispers crescendoed into a cacophony, pleading for acknowledgement, yelling for justice, and in that moment, I knew, I wasn't treating a saint, I was confronting my demons personified in tailored scrubs, a vehicle for all the grief I thought I had buried under layers of self-preservation. And when I caught myself asking why he had come, I was met with a simple truth. He was there to collect what was owed, all the lives I hadn't saved, all the eyes that had searched mine for answers that no doctor could provide. His voice dripped with an unearthly calmness, sending shivers down my spine as he spoke his final words. You cannot save what you've never recognized, the sin is in forgetting. In a fraction of a moment, the shadows became a thick haze, wrapping tightly around me, and I realized I was no longer in control. Saint Michael may have been a healer, but he was also a harbinger, here to remind me that in the medical profession, the weight of a single soul lost is heavier than all the halos in the world, and as I screamed silently, the only thing that remained was the echoes of the ones I couldn't save, trapped eternally in a limbo where hope and despair endlessly intertwine. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, but then again, life has a way of throwing curveballs, especially when you're still reeling from the loss of your father. He died suddenly, his heart giving out while we were watching my little sister's soccer game from the bleachers, and as the paramedics rushed him out, my world shattered into 1,000 pieces, and even now, months later, I can still hear the echo of my mom's sobs blending with the wailing sirens, making it feel like the universe itself was mourning. It was unbearable, like drowning in an ocean of grief, which made what happened at practice last week sting even more. There I was, sweaty and exhausted, pushing through another day of preseason with a team that felt like a second family, mostly. Anyway, I had just completed a grueling set of drills when I overheard Mike, our assistant coach, making a joke about me to one of the other players, something along the lines of, "At least your dad isn't around to see you screw up your shot again." And it took a second for my brain to process it, the words slicing through my fatigue like a knife. Everyone laughed, and it wouldn't leave my mind. I stood frozen in place, shock morphing into an anger so hot I felt like I could explode. Mike was supposed to be my ally, someone who supported me when I was struggling with my performance, but in that moment, he felt beyond cruel. My chest tightened, and without thinking, I snapped, screaming at him about how he'd never understand what it was like to lose someone you loved, how he should be ashamed of himself for making light of such a painful experience, and as I hurled my thoughts at him, I felt the static electricity of tension rise in the air, a terrible silence falling over the field as everyone turned to stare, the laughter dying in their throats. In that instant, I didn't feel like a player, I felt like a monster, one who had unleashed a hurricane of pent-up rage that left no room for mercy or restraint. Mike didn't respond. Instead, he stood there, mouth agape, eyes wide, as if trying to process the full weight of what I had just unleashed. Regret washed over me, rapid and cold, but it was drowned out by the sound of my teammates' hushed whispers. Some seemed to side with me, others looked horrified, and I could see some of the younger players glancing between us with wide, uncertain eyes. I was suddenly hyper-aware of the way I'd let my emotions take control, a raw and ugly display that no one would forget anytime soon. After practice, instead of the usual camaraderie, there was an awkward tension. I overheard the whispers multiply. "Did you hear what he said about his dad?" And that was totally uncalled for, and every word felt like nails dragging down a chalkboard, feeding the anger and humiliation swirling in my gut. I thought about Mike's joke every night when I closed my eyes, replaying it again and again in my head, drifting off to sleep only to awaken in panic. Grappling with images of my father's face flashing before me like a cruel ghost, demanding to know how someone could be so wickedly ignorant. Eventually, it all boiled down to whether or not I was the real asshole in this scenario, if maybe I had overreacted, but wasn't grief meant to be messy and unfiltered? I got on Reddit, crafting a post under the title "A Myth Asshole AITA for lashing out at my coach's assistant for making a joke about my dad who recently passed," thinking there might be solace to be found among strangers, and that's when everything took a turn for the surreal. I clicked post and watched as the responses flooded in. Some were supportive, they echoed my feelings, their words enveloping me in a bubble of understanding, while others criticized my reaction harshly, labeling me as overdramatic, reminding me that it was just a joke, and I was spiraling deeper into a dark abyss as the negatives began to outweigh the positive. Days passed, every notification felt like dominoes crashing down, triggering a problematic spiral of anxiety that gnawed at me relentlessly, and one night, fueled by frustration and a longing for clarity, I decided to confront Mike one last time, clutching a bolt of courage and mentally rehearsing every word. I wanted him to understand the gravity of his words but hadn't anticipated how his face would twist with something between remorse and irritation when I approached. Instead of an apology, I was met with a defensive rant about humor and timing, claiming that nobody gets a pass on bad jokes, and I should grow a spine if I wanted to survive in competitive sports. Incredulous, I felt the anger ignite within me again. But before I could argue, he cut me off, assuring me, loudly enough for the whole team to hear, that his comments were intended to motivate me, to push me through the haze of pain, insisting that if I couldn't handle a light jab, I should really reconsider being on the team. Heart racing, a flood of burning resentment surged through my veins, leaving me caught in a whirlwind of grief and rage, and without thinking, I exploded again, hurling insults I never thought I'd say. "You're not a real coach, Mike. You're just an insecure jerk hiding behind that whistle, and you'll never understand what brave really is." As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of my teammates' expressions, a mix of disbelief and concern that sent a chill down my spine. What was I doing? I was entrapped in this cycle of madness, dragging those around me into my pain. I fled the field, tears stinging my eyes, vowing that I'd find a way to exit this unforgiving labyrinth of anger and loss. When I returned home, I sat in silence, staring at all the soccer trophies Dad asked me to win, and suddenly, it all felt so trivial next to the shattered heart of a son mourning his father. I posted again on Reddit, my fingers shaky as I typed out raw emotions about forgiveness with a hint of hope, but just as soon as I was getting into the flow, a notification popped up. Mike had replied. He wrote a long, condescending note about how I should be grateful for the opportunity to be on the team, that not everyone was as fortunate, and I felt my blood boil as I read through the comment, my insides churning with disbelief at how someone could twist a raw moment into a lesson of character-building resilience. I closed the app, the weight of grief and anger crashing down, and realized the truth. I didn't want to fight the battle anymore. I wanted to honor my father's memory with every kick and goal, but to do that, I needed to rise above the pettiness. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of peace, knowing that perhaps stepping away from the chaos Mike represented was the clearest decision I could make for both my grief and my future in this sport. And although the venting on Reddit had opened a wound that still smarted painfully, it also nudged me toward healing. Now all I needed was the courage to say goodbye to the dark specter that Mike had become in my life, knowing deep down that the strength to move forward was lying just ahead, waiting with open arms. Confession: I left. I left everything and everyone behind me after the breakup. It sounded simple at first, an easy-to-follow impulse born of raw emotion, but what I never anticipated was how truly terrifying freedom could feel. I'll start with the breakup itself, not the typical place you'd think all nightmares begin. After all, I thought, heartbreak was something one could heal from, given time and distance. We had dated for years, woven our lives together so intricately it almost felt like we were one person. Shared house, shared friends, shared future, or so I thought. The end came like thunder on a clear day, swift, unexpected, and it left everything in disarray. "I've found someone else," she said, her voice barely a whisper but somehow louder than a scream in my ears. The betrayal wasn't just in the act but how ordinary she made it seem, like telling someone what the weather was like outside. The shock paralyzed me at first, but as the initial sting faded, a newfound resolve took its place. That's when I planned my escape. I packed a bag with essentials, left a nuanced farewell note not just for her but for anyone who might care, and drove in the dead of night with no specific direction. I wanted to outrun the ghosts of my past, the memories shackling me. I found myself on the serpentine roads of rural nowhere, the night swallowing my car like a forgotten cough in a deep well. I ended up in a town not listed on the maps, its quaint essence almost serene if it weren't for the eerie silence that gripped it like an unyielding fist. Cell service was a stranger here, and for a while, I felt a bizarre kind of peace from disconnection, as if I were in another dimension entirely. My interactions were minimal, mostly exchanging vacant nods with the locals whose eyes seemed shadowed by a history I was yet to uncover. They lived in creaky houses that sat oddly close to one another, like whispered conspiracies. Days dissolved like sugar in lukewarm tea, and I found work at the lone diner, serving slices of pie to faces that never changed, with names I never knew. I thought I'd found solitude. Instead, I had embraced obscurity. But at night, strange things occurred. It began with the barely perceptible, the feeling of an intruder in my new home, though it was just me and the gnarled darkness my sole companions. My belongings would slightly shift, but I blamed the wind or my own faltering memory. Weeks passed, and I became attuned to a sound, a whisper soft as a spider spinning webs in a forgotten attic corner. It spoke my name. No, not spoke, it sighed it, the sound brushing against my eardrums as if apologizing for its intrusion. It was mournful, familiar even, like a voice from a dream only half remembered. Curiosity replaced fear, and I began staying up, waiting for the whispers to return, hoping they'd offer more than just the restless uttering of my name. They never did, not until I was foolish enough to whisper back. My own voice broke the static murmur of night, a timid "Who are you?" I didn't expect an answer, not in words, but something shifted in the air, a coldness enveloping me that set my skin ablaze. The voice returned, clearer now, threading through a symphony of silence. "You left us too soon," it said. The weight of those words sunk deep into my bones, filling the void loneliness had carved within. I knew then it was her, or something that had once been her, and the others whose lives I had entwined with my own and had so desperately abandoned. The most bizarre part was how I wanted to hear more, to dive deeper into this chilling new reality. It's like grief invited itself to stay, and I willingly handed over the key. Days became indistinguishable from nights. I wandered through the town like a ghost myself, blending into walls lined with the grime of untold time. The whispers intensified, each time edging closer, wrapping intimately round my mind with promises of answers to questions I'd not dared to ask. One cold night, the wind howling with a fury I'd never known. The whispers rose to a crescendo. "You can escape again," they beckoned, letting the implications hang in the air like an unmade decision. Driven by the masochistic curiosity of the damned, I followed the dissonant symphony outside. The townsfolk were absent, their absence making everything feel unfinished. I stumbled through the streets, trusting my feet to guide me as the whispers grew more insistent, their weight inescapable, until I reached the edge of town, blurred by the dawn's first unhallowed breath. There stood an ancient house, its silhouette a haunting figure amidst the crawling mist. My heart hammered inside the cage of my ribs as if wishing to flee this place of woven shadows. It felt alive, watching, its windows like eyes full of accusatory glances. I hesitated, then pushed the door open with the uncertain courage of the naive. Inside, the air was stagnant, carrying the scent of stories incomplete. The whispers wrapped around me in a gentle embrace, carrying me to a room filled with mirrors. Endless reflections mocked me from every angle, twisting into contorted likenesses of every fear I'd known. In each reflection, shadows stood beside me. I watched, transfixed, as the shapes clarified into familiar faces, her face, their faces. My breath hitched, a hot iron searing my chest to life. They weren't just here. They never left. The mirrors buzzed with the electrical hum of anticipation until the glass seemed to ripple, opening a window to the life I had chosen to forsake. At that moment, the whispers quieted, leaving me alone with loved ones I'd discarded. Their eyes were on me, not accusingly, but with a weary kindness that cruelly contrasted the growing dread inside me. Then came the terrible realization of their offer, to return, not physically nor metaphorically, but through surrendering oneself, through becoming part of the echoes. I stumbled backward, panic-inducing a clarity I'd never possessed before. That was their secret, the townspeople, their secret pact of belonging far beyond blood or bond, immersed in a world where whispers replaced what they left. In fleeing my pain, I had collided with theirs. Bolting from the house, an accordion of memories, my footsteps found their beat again in the solid world. Behind me, the house stood still, a subtle promise, a continuous allure. The whispers, though quieted, held me. They told tales of eternity where every departure was welcome into their fold. It was a choice many had made before and would again. But not me, not yet. I returned to the semblance of life beyond the town, carrying with me the weight of their sorrow, brushing against the edge of reality, where echoes become life, reminding me that no matter how far I ran, true escape would only ever bring me into their embrace, where silence once roared. I'm about to share something that's been haunting me since childhood, a memory that loops with nightmarish clarity. It's been my secret for years, lurking beneath the surface of my everyday life. I was around 8 when it happened, living in a small, sleepy town where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. It was summer, and the tiresome days dragged on with the lethargic hum of cicadas, the smell of freshly cut grass, and the taste of lemonade mixed with chlorine from countless hours spent at the neighborhood pool. I remember feeling invincible during those long days filled with adventure, but that invincibility was shattered on a day like any other. I'd spent the afternoon exploring the overgrown paths of the woods behind our house, where tall trees conspired with the sky to create dappled patches of golden sunlight on the forest floor. I knew those woods like the back of my hand, or so I thought. That day, everything looked the same until I stumbled upon something unfamiliar, a narrow path I don't remember ever seeing before. My curiosity, naive and reckless, got the better of me, and I ventured further until the path opened to a small clearing dominated by an oddly shaped rock. Its surface was inexplicably smooth, protruding from the earth like an ancient relic. But it wasn't the rock that caught my attention. It was the sound, a soft, almost imperceptible melody, ethereal and enticing. I was drawn to it, my feet moving of their own accord. Beneath the rock was a small hole, just big enough for an arm. Illuminated by slivers of light, tiny objects glittered within. Like any curious child, I knelt and reached inside, my fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. I withdrew it, revealing an old brass key, its surface etched with elaborate, swirling designs. Holding it sent a shiver through me as if I'd disturbed something ancient. I pocketed the key, the melody rising to a crescendo before abruptly cutting off, leaving the woods eerily silent. The air felt dense, pressing against me as I hurried back home. That night, I lay awake, the key heavy beneath my pillow, echoing the unrelenting tick of our old grandfather clock. My sleep was restless, haunted by dreams where the key unlocked doors to dark corridors stretching into infinity. The next day, I was back in the woods, the compulsion irresistible. But as I approached the clearing, something felt off. The air was colder, charged with an unsettling stillness. The clearing was different, The rock gone, replaced by a large, gnarled tree whose roots curled like fingers grasping for something or someone. My heart pounded as I dug where the rock had been, my hands clawing at the earth until I felt it again, the unmistakable touch of brass. Another key. Identical to the first. Panic set in, my mind racing with the impossibility of it. I scrambled back, tripping over roots that seemed to coil and stretch eagerly towards me. Desperate, I ran home, slamming the door behind me, clutching the second key tightly. I didn't sleep that night, plagued by the eerie sense of being watched, the shadows in my room playing tricks on my overactive imagination. My parents noticed my anxiety but dismissed it. After all, I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. But I knew something was wrong, something they couldn't see and I couldn't explain. Days passed in an anxious blur. I avoided the woods, terrified of what else I might find but somehow drawn there, the compulsion gnawing at my mind. Then, as suddenly as it began, the terror shifted. One evening, I found myself at the attic door, a forbidden place ripe with dusty memories and forgotten treasures. The key in my hand seemed to pulse with energy, urging me on. Without thinking, I unlocked the door, each creak of the rusty hinges setting my nerves on edge. The attic should have been dark, but it wasn't. Light flooded from an unknown source, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. My eyes adjusted to the glow, and there, amidst the cobwebs and decay, stood a door, small, inconspicuous, not there before. Trembling, I approached it, the key fitting perfectly into the lock. I hesitated, a deep voice within warning me to stop, to turn back, but curiosity once again drowned out reason. The door creaked open, revealing not the usual sight of rafters and forgotten trunks, but an impossible landscape, a verdant meadow under a twilight sky, the air sweet with unfamiliar scents, the melody from the woods clearer than ever. It was beautiful and utterly wrong. I stood frozen, the surreal beauty battling with the instinctual fear brewing in my belly. Then, the reality of my predicament snapped into focus. For just a second, I caught a glimpse of figures moving within the meadow, shadowy silhouettes beckoning, not with malice, but with a relentless, seductive pull that made resistance seem futile. Frightened out of my mind, I slammed the door shut, the silver of tears on my cheeks a testament to the terror that surged through me. I backed away, the attic darkening once more, and fled downstairs to the comforting familiarity of home. In the normalcy of the following days, I managed to convince myself that I had imagined it all, fabulous lies wrapping tightly around my sanity. I hid both keys, burying them deep in the backyard under the grasping tendrils of the apple tree. As time flowed, the memories dulled yet never vanished, resurfacing at the edge of sleep. Grown now, I still return, tracing the well-worn memory paths, wondering if I should retrieve the keys, face what lies beyond the attic door. The melody lingers, resonating with an invisible promise of understanding and dread. Perhaps one day, I will find myself unable to resist, drawn back to the threshold, where reality and imagination entwine, through the door to a place both terrifying and alluring, where the truth of that summer waits. When my brother Danny announced his engagement to Lily, we were all surprised. Not because Lily is a bad person, far from it. She's charming, lovely, someone you'd instantly want to befriend at a gathering. But there's always been something odd, a kind of unsettling duplicity in her eyes, the kind you notice but can't quite place. Still, they seemed genuinely happy, and that should have been enough. But one evening, as I sat on my mum's floral upholstered sofa, sipping a cup of still warm chamomile tea, she leaned in conspiratorially and said, "Have you ever wondered if she's truly who she says she is?" I laughed it off, but the question wormed its way into my mind. See, Danny had become distant, moody even, since the engagement, and he used to tell me everything. Now he barely returned my calls. Mum had found another outlet for her suspicions, Lily's claims about her past, especially the part about having given birth at 17 and giving the child up for adoption. It seemed tragic, and Lily would often tear up at family gatherings when the subject of children came up. But as we dug deeper, call it gossiping or whatever you want, things didn't add up. There were no hospital records we could find, no pictures of her pregnant, not even a passing mention from any of her old friends about her facing such life-altering circumstances. I figured maybe it was a testament to her privacy, but when 3 different childhood friends of hers had never heard of an adoption, it seemed peculiar, especially since social media is as chatty as it gets. The unease simmered. Mum was adamant and started looking into the possibility of hiring a private investigator. I told her she was being ridiculous, but another part of me, the more superstitious side that often prevails in the dark of night, was curious. I gave in and agreed to accompany her to meet a pie a week later. A small, brisk man named Colin, who listened to our story with an expressionless face, agreed to dig in a little, out of his curiosity more than anything else. The investigation, according to Colin, started unassumingly with phone calls and database searches until, as these stories often go, a strange coincidence blew it wide open. A month before Lily's alleged adoption date, she had spent considerable time in a small coastal town, vacationing with her family. But Colin found no records or even photographs of a girl in her situation, visiting local hospitals or clinics. On a hunch, he followed an old photo to an artist commune near the town, one known for its eccentric gatherings and, as Colin put it, ritualistic interests. There, he stumbled upon what he could only describe as a makeshift shrine: candles, dolls, and a series of unnerving photographs seemingly venerating a pregnant Lily. The artist who had taken the photographs had an unsettling look when Colin mentioned Lily by name, one of realization yet veiled by something darker. He brushed Colin off, calling it an expression of reverence for the ether. Mother. Feeling chills yet unsure of what to make of it, Colin reported back, leaving us and his findings on edge without concrete answers. But we couldn't stop now. The mystery gripped us tighter than any familial loyalty. That night I had a dream, or maybe a vision: Lily, veiled in white, standing at the edge of a forest by the sea, whispering secrets to the night. Her eyes met mine across the distance, deep pools of swirling lies or neglected truths, I couldn't tell. When I awoke, my phone buzzed. It was Danny. I hadn't heard from him in weeks. His voice was strained, tinged with disbelief and fear. He had found something: our father's obituary adorned with another family's name and photographs. His discovery crumbled his world, but for Mum and me, it set in motion the realization of the apparition I had just encountered. The truth unraveled that Lily was not merely deceiving us about her past, but she was intertwined in something bigger, a web of identities manipulated to weave into the lives of unsuspecting families, taking root, and changing fates. A scam? A curse? We discovered after sleepless nights that Lily, or rather the spirit that beckoned through her, had a hold over love and fate, marrying into families, sowing discord, drawing them to the brink of ruin before vanishing without a trace. In our obsession to know more, to protect Danny and bring back his laughter, we dove deeper into the void. I was losing sleep, haunted by those eyes every time I shut mine, as I pieced together the fragmented stories of past victims, finding solace only in Mum, who seemed eerily more resolute, like she was cut from an ethereal cloth, the only one capable of mending the tapestry of lies engulfing us. Whatever entity was feeding off our family's despair, it had erred by underestimating a mother's bond, one that could neither be broken nor rewritten by spectral ambition. I didn't expect to write this, yet my fingers keep typing into the abyss of the internet, seeking counsel or exorcism. Am I the asshole for getting her involved, for trying desperately to unveil a secret sown in darkness? Perhaps. But as the winds outside push eerily against the window panes, carrying whispers of the restless sea, I feel there's more to uncover, a veil yet to be torn. And if you hear your name carried on an unearthly breeze, be forewarned, for the Ether Mother draws near, and she always comes to collect. I never expected the worst day of my life to start with a simple post on Reddit. On the outside, my sister Emily and I seemed like a typical pair of siblings. We had our disagreements and tiffs, but we always found a way back to each other. That was until last Christmas, when the world as I knew it was about to unravel in terrifying ways. Emily and I had always been close growing up. She was 5 years older, the overachiever who set the bar impossibly high for everyone else in the family. I took comfort in my role as the laid-back, somewhat aloof younger brother. But things changed when Emily got married and soon after, to her joy and everyone else's delight, announced her pregnancy. That happiness turned into despair when she had a miscarriage. It was devastating, a punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of our entire family. In the weeks that followed, Emily was understandably inconsolable, shrouded in a fog of grief I'd never seen her in before. Initially, I was nothing but sympathetic, doing whatever I could to help her bear the load. Our family rallied around her, though it always seemed like nothing we did was enough. Emily withdrew from us, sinking deeper into her own world of pain where none of us could reach her. Months passed, yet her grief didn't lighten. Something in her remained fixated on that heart-rending loss to an extent that even family therapy couldn't touch. Then came the day that started it all. It was a regular Sunday afternoon, the sort that blends into hundreds you've lived through before. The winter sun painted ghostly shapes on the walls of my dimly lit apartment as I made half-hearted attempts at tidying up. My phone buzzed with a notification from Emily. "Are you coming over for dinner tonight?" I paused. Emily's dinner invitations had become more frequent, each one drenched in layers of expectation that silently asserted her need for attention. Each gathering turned into some deranged ritualistic commemoration of the life never lived, with Emily occupying the role of high priestess. I'd reached my breaking point. Against my better judgment, I decided to speak with her. "Emily, you need to move on," I texted back hesitantly. "The world doesn't revolve around your miscarriage." As soon as the text sent, a wave of cold dread washed over me. I'd never spoken to her like that, blunt, unsparing. Her reply came almost instantaneously, an empty void of ellipses, followed by a deafening silence. Dinner came and went without much fanfare. I received no wrathful calls, no furious knocks at my door, just nothingness that felt unsettling at its core. That night in bed, sleep refused to come. My brain was a whirlwind of guilt and apprehension. Around 3 a.m., my phone vibrated on my nightstand with a text. It was from an unknown number, a series of encrypted letters that made no sense, garbled and out of order. Confused and curious in equal measure, I stared at it, piecing it together until I realized they were anagrams for Heaven's Echo. Puzzled but overwhelmingly compelled, I typed the phrase into my search bar, finding a no-name chatroom populated with obscure, disparate posts that seemed piecemeal at best. The most recent entry stopped me cold. It was a transcript of my dinner conversation with Emily, word for word, including my ill-considered text. Heart-pounding, I scrolled further, noticing threads that eerily mirrored recent conversations with her, the sort only she and I knew about. The room felt smaller as the air thickened with my racing heartbeats. In hindsight, I should have stopped there, maybe shown it to her as some deranged prank, but curiosity, mixed with gut-twisting horror, got the better of me. Following post after post down the rabbit hole of mystery, it became apparent that I was being watched, recorded by someone who knew our secrets, or something. The clock ticked incessantly towards morning, and as the first light of dawn seeped through my windows, I knew what I had to do. It was time to confront Emily. Fraught with exhaustion and dread, I arrived at her house as shadows of the new day edged into existence. A storm of emotions played on her face as she opened the door, but there was also something else, a chilling calm as if she were expecting me. I struggled to tell her what I'd discovered, poised between anguish and apprehension on her threshold. Her eyes bored into mine, an unsettling smile that sent shivers up my spine curving her lips. Then she said, "You're not the first to see it." The sentence hung in the air, fraught with cloudy ambiguity, and she motioned for me to enter. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, almost oppressive. The house was dim, the drapes drawn. On a coffee table sat several children's toys, ones they'd bought for the baby when it had still been a reality. Emily didn't have to explain further. She'd been delving into the chat room long before my foray, feeding the remnants of her grief to an audience she claimed understood her better than anyone. As Emily recounted her story, a revelation unfolded, a chain letter, a digital haunt, crafted by those whose grief drew them to edge of darkness, promising connection beyond conventional comprehension. The Echoes of Heaven, they called it, a space built on the collective lament of unfinished lives seeking acknowledgement. The people posting and watching aren't quite people anymore, she confessed, belonging to something undefined, like a coalescence of trapped souls trying to cope. I felt the air thin around me, disorientation washed over, followed by Emily's voice, distant and disconnected, urging me to join her, become part of this new family she had embraced. In tears, I realized she was too far gone, ensnared by something eldritch and insidious. I tried, maybe too late, to save her from herself, but felt her slipping even further away as if vanishing into shadows, her presence flickering like static on an unsettled screen. Overwhelmed by the encroaching danger I couldn't quite name, I backed out of the house, my escape frantic, a beating retreat into coherence. Once outside, the world felt normal again, sunlight mingling with fear on my skin. I knew I had lost Emily to something that blurs the lines between grief and horror. The chatroom remains live, tethering me and others who dare enter to an existence diverging from linear reality. I remain haunted by the thought that's turned my nights cold and hollow. Maybe she wasn't the one I was trying to save. The autumn leaves crunched under my feet as I stood in front of the dusty, old mansion that once belonged to my family, the place where my brother Jason and I spent countless childhood summers, but now it was a decaying shell, haunted not just by memories but by something darker. You see, Jason was always the golden boy, smart, charming, and, despite my efforts to connect, utterly aloof. I had watched, helplessly, as he spiraled down the rabbit hole of addiction, desperate to escape the crushing weight of life's demands, eventually losing everything, his job, friends, our parents' trust, until he was just a shadow of the boy I once admired. I tried to save him, I really did, pouring my heart into trying to reason with him, But the drugs had tethered him to a nightmare I couldn't penetrate, and doctors whispered of rehab like it was some magical fix, while I felt something festering deep in my soul, something dark and primal whispering that maybe all this suffering had a purpose. On the night of his final overdose, I was at my wit's end, staring at his frail body, the once bright spark in his eyes reduced to nothing more than a lifeless void, and as I called 911, a flicker of something sinister ignited within me. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, the only way to truly help him was to drag his soul out of this earthly torment and send it to a hell far worse than anything I could imagine, a hell designed for souls like his, lost and hollow, addicted and craving the oblivion that only a darker world could provide. The hallucinations had started afterwards, strange voices whispering my name, calling me a savior, twisting my conscience into something unrecognizable, until I stumbled upon a tattered grimoire hidden in the attic. Searching for a way to help my brother had somehow pulled me toward this dark tome penned in ancient runes and hopeful desperation. With trembling fingers, I traced the words that promised to free souls from their earthly binds and send them to a place where they could confront their demons. Not that I was naive enough to believe in salvation, it was clear that something darker lurked beneath my resolve, but as I chanted the incantations, under the ghostly glow of the full moon, I felt power coursing through me, and for the first time, I believed I could help him. The rituals felt like a fever dream, a dance of shadows beneath the moonlight, and when I finally made my way to the rotting room where Jason lay, something in me shifted. I could feel the air crackle with electricity and despair, and I knew I had to make the hardest choice of my life. As I hovered over him, I whispered the final words, feeling the heat radiate from his body as if his very essence was being pulled from him. The fear in his eyes morphed into confusion, then anguish, and as I peered into the abyss, I heard his voice, a pitiful scream melding with the darkness that enveloped him. The room went cold as reality. Warped, stripping my brother of flesh and burden, unleashing him into a void where the shadows promised to teach him the lesson I could never impart. My heart raced, fueled by both guilt and resolve, and when the air settled, the silence felt deafening. I stood alone, forever marked by the choice I had made, grappling with the whispering assurance that I had finally set him free. But the relief didn't last long. By morning, the house was still engulfed in a heavy silence, thick like fog, and I realized I was no longer alone. The weight of Jason's absence wrapped around me, suffocating and palpable, a constant reminder of my sins. I thought I had done the right thing, but as the days turned into weeks, darkness seeped into my mind. I wasn't just haunted by the remorse of losing my brother, I was haunted by the things I had unleashed. The darkness that I believed could help him began to feast on my very soul. Every creak of the house became a whisper laced with mockery, his laughter twisted into something sinister, his form sometimes flickering in the corner of my eye, taunting me for thinking I had saved him, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I'd acted out of love, the shadows grew stronger, vowing that Jason's fate was irrevocable. I feared sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I plunged back into that nightmarish realm where I'd sent his soul, but instead of anguish, there was only a calm acceptance in the darkness, and I knew that my love had chained him to something far worse than the world I sought to save him from. Each night felt like a descent into madness as the boundaries blurred between reality and the nightmares I had crafted. I could almost hear his voice calling my name, a soft echo filled with betrayal, and with every heartbeat, the house seemed to pulse in rhythm with my rising dread, whispering what I had always tried to deny. I hadn't saved him, I had merely condemned us both. Now, weeks later, when I dare venture into a corner of the old mansion that still reeks of memories and regrets, I catch flickers of movement, a shadow darting just beyond my reach, the echo of a laugh, chillingly sweet yet profoundly heart-wrenching. His face, once angelic, now twisted by the darkness I had unleashed, fills my dreams with torment. I realize too late that I had sent my brother to hell for his own good, and now, every night, he visits me in my sleep, dragging me closer to the brink, calling me deeper into the shadows, begging for release and demanding that I join him in the depths from which he may never escape. I've always been infatuated with stories, the kind that grip you by the throat and don't let go until you've turned the last page, but this time I find myself caught in a story of my own making that's turning into a tale of horror I never intended. 10 years ago, long before my world crumbled in this breakup, I created this account. Back then, I was just a college student procrastinating assignments and finding solace in the chatter of people who seemed just as lost as I felt. But somewhere along the way, amidst the shared memes and late-night discussions about everything from the paranormal to the mundane, this account became a diary, a personal vault for my thoughts and feelings. I'm ashamed to admit how often I've used it to vent about Lucy, my partner, ex-partner, and our crumbling relationship. Lately, I felt a detached curiosity exploring the dark corners of this site, seeking distraction from the silence that has filled my apartment since she left. That's when I stumbled upon an old thread about digital spirits. Of course, the logical part of my brain knows it's all nonsense, but it's hard not to feel a chill when you're all alone, reading stories of people who claim their accounts have taken on a life of their own. Wanting to numb my heartache with something more tangible, I disregarded the warnings users shared about these spirits needing a purpose, something to hold on to, and what happens if their existence becomes too entwined with your own. It started 2 nights ago when I awoke to the sound of typing. It was faint at first, like the gentle patter of rain against a window pane, but it grew louder, filling the void Lucy's absence had left behind. At first, I brushed it off as a residual hallucination from my restless sleep, but when I logged in the next morning, I was struck by the peculiar responses from users I barely recognized, asking about cryptic messages I'd supposedly sent them overnight. My inbox was flooded with odd snippets of conversations, void of context, echoing memories of the moments I'd shared with Lucy, as if the account had absorbed my pain and was projecting it back at me. One message stood out, sent from my account: "I'm lost without her." I didn't remember typing it, yet the words resonated with a haunting accuracy, like an echo from my subconscious. Driven by a growing unease, I deleted the messages, hoping that would be the end of it. But the phenomenon persisted, each night's disruption more sinister than the last. Fragments of conversations appeared online, arguments with Lucy, declarations of love that once sealed our bond, and private confessions I had never dared utter aloud. It felt like I was peeling back layers of my past, exposing the wounds I hadn't allowed myself to properly close. I tried everything, reaching out to moderators, changing passwords, even contemplating deleting the account that had stood with me for a decade. Yet, I hesitated. A part of me wondered if surrendering my digital ghost story was akin to severing the last thread tied to a life I wasn't ready to fully let go. Last night, the typing was relentless. Accompanied by the unshakable sense of being watched, I got up to check my office, heart pounding like thunder in the night. The screen glowed an eerie blue, the cursor blinking in time with my racing pulse, typing a repetitive mantra: "Confess. Confess. Confess." The word was heavy with demand, as if the account, no, the entity it had become, was urging me to confront something buried deep within my conscience. Haunted by a past I still mourn, sleep-deprived, and teetering on the edge of sanity, I did as it asked. I confessed to the void, whispering to my reflection in the screen the guilt I felt for not fighting harder, for letting the love Lucy and I shared slip through the cracks of mundane life and trivial arguments. The keys were cold under my fingers, but I typed long into the early hours, unearthing secrets and regrets I had buried under layers of denial. The words flowed like blood from an open wound, my jealousy, my selfish moments, my fear of vulnerability. As I emptied my heart into the machine, the heaviness lifted ever so slightly. Exhausted, I passed out with my head slumped over the keyboard. The ominous typing ceased that night, leaving me in silence. Today it feels different. My messages are untouched, as if the account has been satiated by the truths I unveiled. My heart still aches, but the weight is less oppressive, as though sharing those confessions with the anonymous abyss of the internet has unshackled my spirit from the burdens I alone carried. Yet, I can't shake off this eeriness, a paranoia that hasn't left since the typing started. There's a message in my drafts I don't recall writing: "I'm free. Thank you." It's not signed. A warning or a farewell, I can't be sure, but I know one thing for certain: I opened a door, and something stepped through. Whether it was a reflection of my inner turmoil or a spirit from the depths of cyberspace, I'm left with a choice: to leave the account as a relic of who I once was, or to erase it entirely, severing this bizarre connection. I can't help but wonder, as I gaze into the comforting glow of my screen, whether I'm ready to face what might happen next. And if I do let it go, what phantom might I invite into my quiet solitude? Things had been tense between Kelly and me ever since the engagement. Karen, Kelly's mother, had disapproved from day one. She believed I wasn't career-focused enough for her daughter, which was ironic given that my startup was finally taking off. My relationship with Kelly seemed like a perfect story, college sweethearts who defied odds and family expectations to be together. But Karen's hovering presence constantly loomed over us like a storm about to break. Our engagement was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance for happiness, yet when Karen unexpectedly passed away, everything turned upside down. One night, just after dinner, Kelly asked if I would help pay for Karen's funeral. The words left me stunned. It wasn't that I couldn't afford it, the startup had its ups and downs, but I could manage. It was the principle of it. Karen had never treated me with an ounce of kindness or respect. Every holiday, every birthday, she found ways to insult me in ways that Kelly always seemed to dismiss as her stress talking. Despite all this, I had tried to be understanding, putting on a brave face for Kelly's sake. Now, it felt like a final betrayal, a strange request from the love of my life but in some twisted shape that no longer felt loving, more like an obligation. Kelly's plea echoed around my mind, she didn't have much, and it's the least we can do. We. That word stung, as if now I were suddenly part of a collective unity that, when it came to Karen, had always been absent. I tried to reason through my conflicting feelings, muttering something about how I would think about it, knowing in my gut my answer was likely a solid no. The night stretched on with its oppressive silence. Kelly retreated to the bedroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts, the flickering light of the TV the only companion. It was then that I noticed the cold air in the room, despite the furnace working. The temperature had dipped unnaturally, sending a shiver twisting up my spine. The pictures on the walls, their occupants staring vacantly, deepened the unease that danced along my conscious mind. Just as I dismissed it as nothing more than a freak draft, the light flickered once more before plunging the room into darkness. A power outage? Yet it felt more personal, somehow. The atmosphere grew heavy, pressing against my temples as my own heartbeat filled the silence. Fumbling for the flashlight on the coffee table, I called out to Kelly, but she didn't respond. The feeble beam cut through the dark, casting long shadows that seemed to quiver with life. As my eyes adjusted, I saw her, Karen, or at least something that wore her face. She stood by the window, illuminated by the ambient glow of the streetlights filtering in. Her expression was twisted in hatred, every part of her resonating the disdain she'd shown in life but now magnified, amplified. She didn't move, didn't speak, yet a voice filled my head, dripping with contempt and malice. For all you took from her, you owe her this much. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath quickening as I stumbled away. This wasn't real, couldn't be real. The specter vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving me shaking, questioning my sanity. But the chill remained, permeating the very air. Kelly was still not responding, and a dread clawed its way through me as I pushed the bedroom door. It opened softly to reveal her peacefully asleep, completely unaware of the turmoil that had taken place within our home. I couldn't bring myself to wake her, not like this. Instead, I lay beside her, eyes fixed on the ceiling, chaos swirling in my mind. The next few days were a blur. Kelly seemed oblivious, completely and mercifully unaware of what I had witnessed. Karen's funeral approached, every step toward it feeling like it pulled me, dragged me toward an abyss I feared to name. As much as I tried to convince myself it was all stress, all the hallucination of a mind overworked, depleted, the memory clung to me. Every shadow seemed to hide her, every cold draft was a whisper of her presence. The day of the funeral arrived under gray skies threatening rain. I decided, in a moment of clarity or perhaps surrender, that I would contribute. Not because she had convinced me in life or even in that haunting moment, but because Kelly deserved peace. The ceremony was a somber affair, hushed tones and stolen glances that I pretended not to notice. As we laid her to rest, the clouds broke and the first drops of rain fell, mingling with silent tears. I would never tell Kelly what I saw, not fully. Instead, I held her hand, shared her grief, and whispered reassurances against the cold reality of our shared silence. Yet, every so often, in the quiet moments when the world fades, I feel a chill, a reminder of that darkened room, of promises extracted from the depths of fear. And as much as I want to believe in moving on, some specters never fully release their hold. I didn't want to go to my sister-in-law's house for Christmas in the first place. It was always an awkward affair, an obligatory family gathering where passive-aggressive comments masked themselves as festive cheer. But this year felt different. It felt like genuine dread, like a creeping shadow crawling down my spine the moment I pulled into the driveway. Her husband, Dave, gives off an unsettling energy, his laughter always just a beat too loud, his eyes too scrutinizing, as if he's continually sizing everyone up for some unseen threat. I arrived at the house late, my mind echoing with the biting words my sister-in-law had thrown my way during years of family gatherings, each one landing heavier than the last, but the guilt of family obligation made me push on. The lights twinkled outside like a cover-up, and inside, the tree towered menacingly in a corner, adorned with decorations that looked like they were straight out of a horror film. Half of them were homemade, the crooked stitching and uneven glitter sparking an unshakable sense of dread. As the night wore on and we gathered around the table, my sister-in-law began her usual routine of loud, boastful stories, desperately trying to keep everyone entertained while Dave sat back with a hushed, sinister smile, occasionally chuckling at jokes that felt more like jabs. Tensions escalated over my refusal to try the figgy pudding, an ugly concoction she proudly proclaimed was a long-standing family tradition, and as I pushed the plate away, Dave's joviality darkened. "Come on, lighten up, it's Christmas," he barked, but it was the beat that followed, the tense silence, the wicked grin on his face, that made my skin crawl. My stomach twisted with anxiety, as well as something that felt dangerously like anger, and I decided enough was enough. I excused myself, abruptly standing up, and as I made my way to the door, I could feel the suffocating atmosphere shift. Dave's laughter turned into a low growl, a warning, "Where the hell do you think you're going?" I felt emboldened, adrenaline surging through me like poison. I huffed that I was leaving, that I couldn't stand another minute in this house, in this strange, warped celebration that felt like a funeral disguised as a feast, when suddenly the air turned electric. He jumped up, fury carved into his features like a mask, the words pouring from his mouth as if they were a dam bursting. "You think you're better than us? Just because you can't handle a little family time?" I nearly stumbled as the reality of his rage settled heavy around me. I didn't even have to reply before he marched over, stepping into my personal space, and spat some of the foulest curses I've ever heard. My heart thundered in my chest as his breath washed over me, hot and reeking of whiskey, and without thinking, I brushed past him, practically flying out the door with panic clawing at my heart, feeling his anger throb in the air behind me. I didn't look back, didn't slow down, until I got to my car, but even then, as I fumbled with the keys, something twisted in my gut. The silence of their house was conspicuously unnerving, a stark contrast to the tumultuous scene I'd just escaped. As I drove away, my heart still raced, but I also felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. I was sure that I'd hear from my in-laws about how I had ruined Christmas, how I was the asshole, but something lurked in the back of my mind, Dave's face, twisted and grotesque in my memory. It wasn't until I got home that unease sank in. The usual sense of warmth and peace was replaced by an oppressive darkness that clung to me, wrapping around my thoughts and tightening its grip. I poured myself a stiff drink to wash it away, tried indulging in the comfort of failing Christmas movies, but no distraction seemed powerful enough to dull the spiking sensations of dread and rage roiling within. I felt watched, the shadows lengthening around me as the wind howled outside, more sinister than usual, whispering tales of guilt. Then, my phone buzzed, shattering the silence. It was my sister-in-law, and the message was a withering exception to the holiday spirit. "Hope you're happy ruining Christmas for everyone, you selfish jerk." My stomach dropped, and I hurriedly typed a reply, trying to quell the storm of hurt and anger erupting inside me as I explained myself, but before I could hit send, I heard a soft rustling outside my window. I froze, pulse quickening. A figure lurked just outside the reach of the light, shrouded in shadows, but unmistakably familiar. "Dave." My breath caught in my throat, my chest tightened, and as I debated whether to call the police or confront him, I remembered the look in his eyes, that twisted delight in asserting control over an entire room, and I suddenly felt trapped in a prison of my own making. What followed blurred the line between reality and nightmare. I mustered the courage to peek through the blinds, and there he was, grinning, all teeth, gaze unfocused yet fixated on me, and in that moment, I knew, I wasn't just the asshole. I had opened a door, and he had stepped through, ready to turn my Christmas nightmare into an unending hell. In that moment, I realized that some arguments mean far more than they appear, that some family gatherings hold secrets darker than any figgy pudding could conceal. It was a Tuesday night when the thing fell from the sky, a flash of light illuminating my backyard before the deafening crash shook the ground beneath my feet, my heart hammering as I peered through the window, half expecting to see fire and destruction, but instead, I found a strange, smoldering object nestled among my garden gnomes. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the air heavy with an odd metallic smell, and there it was, a rock-like structure, shimmering with iridescence and odd geometric patterns that seemed to pulse as if it were alive. In the following days, I tried ignoring it, going about my life, work, endless emails, the mundane grind, until a week later when, just as I was settling in for a quiet evening, there she stood at my doorstep, a woman who was so stunningly beautiful she could have been a dream but for the unsettling aura that surrounded her. Her porcelain skin glowed faintly under the porch light, and her hair fell like liquid silver down her back. Her eyes, however, were the worst part, swirling with colors that felt wrong, like staring directly into a nebula. I stuttered introductions, but she only smiled, that perfect smile that felt like it belonged to someone who had never known pain, and then she said, "I came to thank you." When I pressed her for details, she merely tilted her head, studying me with a curiosity that made the hairs on my neck stand up. As we talked, or rather, as she talked, her melodic voice weaving strange tales of worlds beyond our comprehension, she hinted at knowing about the object that had crashed, how it was a vessel turned cage that had perhaps, just maybe, freed something that should have remained locked away. I tried to dismiss her words as the ramblings of a beautiful lunatic, but then she reached out and brushed her fingers against my arm, and in that moment, I felt a jolt of electricity rush through me, the very essence of her being poking and prodding at the edges of my sanity. Over the next few days, she returned, unannounced, each visit more charged with an aura of otherworldliness than the last, bringing strange gifts, stones that vibrated in my hands and flowers that twinkled like stars, as if she were feeding my curiosity, or perhaps my madness, feeding something dark inside me that had been awakened when that thing fell from the sky. My friends were worried, saying I was becoming a shell of myself, but they couldn't see what I saw, the way she moved, fluid and unnatural, or the way her laughter, tinkling like glass, resonated deep within my bones, awakening feelings I'd buried long ago. I became enamored, yet frequently perplexed, wonder and dread tangled tightly as I discovered there appeared to be an odd predatory quality lying just beneath her beauty. One evening, she invited me to see the truth behind the crash. The way she looked at me made my pulse quicken with both excitement and fear. Caught in her spell, I agreed, and as we stood before the strange object, its form, now twisted and blackened, illuminated under the moonlight, she reached out, whispering things beneath her breath, a language that sent shivers down my spine, and suddenly, I found myself engulfed in an overwhelming sensation, memories flooding back, visions of countless worlds, creatures dancing among the stars, echoes of voices crying out in a chorus of despair. Her grip tightened as if anchoring me against the tide of knowledge threatening to drown my mind, and then I saw it, the shadows, a darkness leaking from the cracks in the vessel, tendrils creeping into every space, searching, hunting, longing for freedom, and with each breath, I understood she had been sent to bridge the gap between the dimensions as a herald of their arrival, a stunning siren promising a transformation that would eventually cost everything I knew and held dear. Overwhelmed and terrified, I staggered back, confronted with the truth that her beauty was but a veil hiding a darkness so profound I couldn't fully comprehend it. I turned to flee, the crushing weight of dread pushing me towards the house, but she grabbed my wrist, her grip like iron, and for a moment, I saw something flash in her eyes, a savage hunger or maybe hope, but in that moment of desperation, I felt a surge of defiance, a need to survive. I pulled away, rushing into my home, slamming the door shut behind me, but I could still hear her voice, sweet and serene, beckoning from the other side, promising that what awaited was more beautiful than anything I could ever imagine. Days turned into weeks as I tried to erase her from my mind, the whispers echoing, growing more insistent, pulling at the edges of my consciousness, taunting me with dreams of lush landscapes and yet unimaginable horrors, and I wondered what would happen if I just let go, gave in to the allure of that dark promise. But each time I caught myself, clutching my sweat-soaked sheets in the aftermath of nightmares filled with shadowy tendrils reaching for me, I'd remember the look in her eyes and it would ground me in my resolve. Then one cold night, when soil and frost clung heavily to the ground, there was a knock at the door, and before I even opened it, I knew it was her. There she stood, radiant under the moonlight, a shadow merging with the dark and cold, confidence swirling around her like smoke, and as she stepped in, I realized I had been foolish to think I could escape. I backed away, heart racing, but she only smiled sweetly, the darkness swirling behind her, almost waiting, poised for me to make my choice. "You ran from me," she said softly, and I wanted to scream that I hadn't run. I'd been fighting against the void that I knew she was a part of. I felt that pull again, stronger now, and in a moment of desperation, I grabbed the first object I could find, a heavy brass lamp, and swung it at her, the sound of metal meeting flesh echoing through my home. But the impact was like hitting water. She shifted, subtle and effortless, her expression unchanged as she leaned closer, and all I could do was watch as the shadows spilled forth from her form, filling the room, encompassing me, suffocating me as I tried to escape, tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. In that moment, I realized my resistance was futile. Once you've looked into the void, it saturates your very essence, and now, I was forever bound to her call, no longer capable of turning my back, not a prisoner, but a partner in the darkness that awaited us both. As the shadows settled around me, I felt the warmth of her hand intertwining with mine, and together, we stepped into the unknown, a leap from which there would be no return, leaving behind only the remnants of my former life, a life that had been extinguished the moment she arrived, a new chapter written in the ink of the abyss. I should have known something was off about Jason when we first agreed to sign the lease together, but back then, My main concern was finding someone who would make the rent more bearable. He seemed nice enough, a bit quirky, perhaps, but hell, who isn't these days? The apartment was perfect, 2 spacious rooms, a cozy living room, and a kitchen with a refrigerator that didn't hum angrily, unlike the one in my crummy old studio. Early on, it seemed like I'd hit the jackpot, until I opened the freezer one night and found it packed to the brim with what looked like sealed dinner trays, each labeled with a date. Meal prepping is key to a healthy lifestyle, Jason had explained, his words punctuated by a nervous chuckle that I soon learned was his go-to when things got awkward. I didn't even think about it too much until the stack of those trays seemed to propagate like rabbits. What had started as a manageable annoyance turned into full-blown frustration as I realized my own supplies were relegated to one measly corner. Snack by snack, I watched my space dwindle. I tried avoiding confrontation. I really did. But let's face it, ramen and canned soup lose their charm quickly when that's all you have stored outside the freezer. One night, after a grueling day filled with the kind of endless meetings that sap your soul, I came home craving the simplicity of solitary dining comfort, a frozen pizza. That's when I decided it was time to have the talk. Jason, maybe it's time we start storing less so there's more room for everyone? I'd said as diplomatically as possible, but Jason's expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite read. It didn't seem angry, more like someone who just remembered they left the stove on. Or in his case, the freezer. He mumbled something about needing everything stored for documentation and hurried off to his room, leaving me standing there, frozen like the neglected dinner stuffed in our appliance. I decided to investigate. A quick shuffle through the neatly organized trays revealed something unsettling. Each label had a name, some I recognized as his ex-girlfriend Sarah's, his distant relatives I'd never met, and shockingly, even mine, dated the day we'd moved in. I wanted to believe it was some twisted quirk of his dietary plans, but the gnawing pit in my stomach told me otherwise. My instincts edged me to question the nature of those meals. I tried to track down Sarah, wanting to underline her name on Facebook only to find her profile inactive for months. That's when a deep unease settled in, the kind that douses your heart in cold dread and leaves you wallowing in paranoia. The next morning, I pretended to sleep in the living room, keeping one eye trained on the kitchen. At precisely 3 a.m., Jason emerged, moving with unsettling purpose toward the freezer. The pale refrigerator light cast strange shadows on his face as he extracted 3 trays, laying them out on the counter as if carefully selecting from a cursed deck of cards. I must have accidentally let out too loud a breath because he suddenly stiffened, his head turning slightly as though he sensed the pinprick stare of my barely closed eyes. Feigning a sleepy shuffle, I coughed and made a beeline for the bathroom, not daring to meet his eyes. I returned to the living room to find Jason gone and the trays missing. My thoughts raced. Should I confront him? Call the cops? I decided that a more subtle approach was needed, so I planted a small camera facing the kitchen, its eye trained upon the fridge's realm, hoping it would unearth some sanity to Jason's midnight ritual. That night, having inhaled enough caffeine to power a blender, I couldn't look away from the feed. The camera caught him again, this time tracing a finger over the trays, as though he were communing with each sealed package, his eyes, dull and absent. It wasn't until I replayed the footage in slow motion that I noticed the eerie thing. His lips were moving, forming soundless words too fast for me to decipher. I enlisted the help of a friend who worked in audio engineering, hopeful he could uncover the whispered secret. The dark revelation came 2 days later in the form of an email that left a chill crawling over my skin. Jason wasn't uttering benign pleasantries but rather, grotesque incantations, calling upon something that should have been left dormant. I knew I couldn't stay there, not with him and his frozen altars to entities I dared not comprehend. Before fleeing that night with a hastily packed bag, I made the mistake of seeking clarity, implying I was no longer comfortable with the arrangement. Jason's response was peculiar. It wasn't one of anger or despair, but relief, as if a burden had been gently lifted from his shoulders. He watched with unsettling composure as I exited the door, and it wasn't until weeks later, when police found my name etched into the ice on his final remaining tray, that I realized why. In his twisted ritual, it seemed sacrifice always needed a witness. Ever since the accident, the echoes of blame have reverberated through our quiet suburban house, vibrating through its walls with a menacing persistence that no amount of silence could quell. It all started on a lazy Sunday afternoon when our 9-year-old daughter, Emily, decided she wanted to try out her new rollerblades. The sun was bright, casting a hopeful glow over our cul-de-sac, and I was lounging in the backyard, half listening to Emily's gleeful shrieks while my wife, Sarah, was inside occupied with her baking. Emily had been begging for rollerblades for weeks, swearing she'd learned it from watching her friends. I admit I was skeptical, her legs wobbly like a newborn deer whenever she tried balancing on those wheels. But today was different, she was determined, and I figured a little outdoor activity wouldn't hurt. But as I relaxed in my chair, letting the rhythmic creak of a swinging hammock lull me, I heard the unmistakable, heart-stopping scream. I jumped, rushing to the front yard where I found her lying on the asphalt, clutching her arm bent at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide with terror and pain. Time seemed to fragment as Sarah appeared at the door, her expression morphing from confusion to horror in the blink of an eye. We spent the next several hours navigating the sterile corridors of the local hospital, the doctor's voice low murmur about fractured bones and surgeries while Emily whimpered in her hospital bed. Beside me, Sarah teetered between composed reassurance for our daughter and a seething anger directed at me. It was as if I'd personally fashioned the ground to rise up and meet Emily, rather than a freak accident. We were buzzed with adrenaline, each of us taking turns to stand by Emily's side until exhaustion took us by the hand and led us to the uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting room. It was there that Sarah's patience fractured. A quiet argument broke out, a whisper curse over who was to blame. She accused me of negligence, of not watching closely enough. Her words were daggers wrapped in hushed tones, wielded silently but lethally. I countered, arguing that kids fall, kids get hurt, it's all part of growing up. But her eyes, usually so full of warmth, were cold and hard as winter ice, and her voice was a scant thread of composure away from a hysterical break. The door creaked as a nurse stepped out to reassure us that Emily was in good hands now, but it did little to thaw the glacial distance forming between us. Returning home, the house felt like an eerie, unfamiliar place, a shell housing the ghosts of laughter that used to resonate between its walls. Sarah moved through routines mechanically, her presence quiet but edged sharply against everything warm and forgiving. We barely talked, and when we did, it always wormed its way back to that day. I realized quickly that Sarah sought a scapegoat for her guilt, a tangible foe to fight rather than the uncontrollable chaos of life. Her days were peppered with phone calls to her friends and family, each conversation underscored by whispers and silent judgments I could feel in every side glance the community cast my way. Soon am I the asshole? Was a thought that chased me down hallways and slipped into my dreams, a question that twisted in my gut whenever I tried to rationalize my actions. Weeks later, the tension had solidified into a palpable entity. Our house felt inhabited by an unspoken wrath. Sarah remained curt, interactions reduced to the perfunctory exchange of essential information. Conversations at the dinner table with Emily, now with her arm in a neon pink cast, were stilted and uncomfortable, the cheer she once brought diluted into politeness. I watched as Sarah's attitude seeped into Emily's perception. She grew tentative, her laughter muted, seeking her mother's approval with desperation that broke my heart. I knew I had to force a confrontation, to challenge the narrative being built around me. One night, long after Emily was tucked into bed and the overcast sky draped our house in shadows, I decided to clear the air. We stood in the dimly lit kitchen, the refrigerator's hum filling the silence as Sarah meticulously dried dishes. I poured out everything I'd been keeping inside, acknowledging my oversight without shouldering all the blame. The kitchen's dim light cast long shadows that seemed to stretch like the truth between us. As I spoke, Sarah's expression began to shift, bit by bit cracking the ice that encased her empathy. Frustration and fatigue melted into sorrow, her eyes welling with tears that had been wrongfully dammed by pride and anger. She admitted to being terrified of losing control, of the world's tendency to unfurl in chaos, and the paralyzing fear that Emily's accident had brought. It was a mother's worst fear realized. We were two people navigating the trauma of parenthood, bound by love yet ripped by anxiety over the safety of our child. The air between us, thick with blame and misunderstanding, slowly lifted as we recognized the burdens each carried invisibly. We embraced, a silent apology passing between us that mere words could never articulate. We promised to rebuild, brick by unsteady brick, the structure of understanding that stood cracked in our marriage. Emily needed parents who picked each other up after a fall, not ones who stayed sprawled on the pavement of guilt and recrimination. As the morning light spilled into the kitchen, illuminating the dust motes that danced merrily in its glow, Sarah and I sat close, sipping weak coffee, and for the first time since Emily's accident, that oppressive question didn't carry the same weight. It was as if opening our souls to vulnerability had released a specter, allowing us to coexist as joint guardians of our daughter against the unpredictable whirl of life. Gradually, conversations normalized, and Emily began rolling her eyes at our dad jokes, her cast a badge of bravery she loved showing off. In the end, it wasn't about siding with anyone, it was about finding security in a world of uncertainty, The realization that we could falter and still be each other's anchor in the storm. I was never the type to believe in urban legends or ghost stories, but when my sister vanished from a place that officially doesn't exist, I had to reconsider everything. It started on a late August afternoon when Anna decided to take a weekend trip into the mountains, claiming she found this quaint little town called Eldridge Falls that wasn't far off her hiking trail. She was always searching for secluded spots to uncover and photograph, a passion that doubled as an escape from the daily grind of the city. A week passed without any word from her, which wasn't overly concerning until her calls went straight to voicemail. Her texts received no acknowledgement. I drove through the drizzly afternoon towards the GPS coordinates she had last shared, past rusted signposts and withered trees, feeling the uncanny sensation of the world falling away behind me. As the pavement disappeared into gravel, my skepticism mingled with an uneasy realization. I was entering a place unnamed on my maps, its existence whispered in hushed tones by locals who spoke of shadowy occurrences and inexplicable disappearances. The town materialized around a bend, like a page turned too quickly in a forgotten book. Its narrow streets were eerily deserted, the paint flaking off the quaint Victorian-style homes lining them. The air felt stagnant, time suspended in this pocket of forgotten America. Despite the setting sun, a disconcerting lack of sound surrounded me, no crickets, no birds, just oppressive silence. I found the inn Anna had mentioned booking, a rundown relic that seemed abandoned, its sign faintly swinging in foreboding creaks. An old woman behind a dusty front desk eyed me with what seemed like ill-concealed disdain, or perhaps pity. Her deep-set eyes were murky, pools of forgotten memories. When I mentioned my sister, she seemed to shudder slightly, muttering something about people who venture too far. She handed over a key absent-mindedly, as if her mind had wandered to darker realms. My room was something pulled from an old black-and-white photograph, a claustrophobic space draped in shadows tinged with sepia. The first night was unsettling, dreams of Anna whispering warnings blurred with visions of shadowy figures moving just beyond the periphery of my consciousness. I woke in a cold sweat, feeling as if I were being observed. Determined to find any trace of her, I spent the daylight hours exploring the town. Eldridge Falls seemed caught in a time just out of reach from progress, a place where every door seemed firmly shut, every window an opaque eye hiding unknown truths. Asking about Anna only drew blank stares or nervous flutterings. It was clear they knew something, but an undercurrent of fear held them silent. My nights were restless, the dreams becoming more vivid, more oppressive, as if the town, or something within it, was trying to tell me something it couldn't say when awake. On the fourth day, I stumbled onto a path leading out of town, partly hidden by overgrown weeds and a decaying wooden marker with no discernible script. I followed it against the intuitive urge to turn back, my resolve steeled by memories of Anna's laughter. The path wound into a dense forest, draped in mystic fog, the sunlight filtering through in dull whispers. Each step echoed, each rustle set my heart pounding. Then, I found the remnants of a cable car station, cables trailing ominously into the clouds above, and a ledger inside, the last entry in a neat hand, and his unmistakable scrawl, scrawled across the page, met some people. Exploring further. Eldridge Falls hides secrets. The next few hours were a blur of frantic investigation. The townsfolk grew more reticent, their eyes pleading for me to stop. When I visited the local library, an echoing chamber of dust and forgotten lore, the librarian, a gnarled man with eyes that danced like fireflies, whispered frenetically about the history of Eldridge Falls, a settlement erased from official records following a tragic mining incident decades earlier. He hinted at something more sinister than bureaucratic negligence, something ancient, a binding fate inked in blood, he called it. My determination gave way to despair drenched in urgency, but the librarian pressed a fragile envelope into my hand, mumbling about truths no one wanted to see. Inside was a photograph, the grainy depiction of revelers in a bygone festival, and his face unmistakably surrounded by unfamiliar figures whose eyes seemed to see beyond the image. I returned to the inn stunned, my skin crawling with the cold breath of the unseen world pressing in closer. That night, my dreams turned violent, as if something wanted out, thrashing within the confines of my mind. When dawn broke, I made my decision, to leave, to bring back help if necessary, but my resolve wavered as a new weight pressed upon me. Anna, whose laughter now echoed mockingly through the stillness, faded into it. But I couldn't just leave without knowing. On my final exploration, I stumbled upon an entrance to what seemed like an underground complex, eerily beckoning and foreboding. An insistent yet inaudible call. Some may say curiosity is dangerous, but perhaps it was kinship that drove me to descend into the darkness, into the belly of Eldridge Falls that morning. As I trudged deeper, electrical cables intertwined with gnarled roots in an unsettling dance beneath the earth, weaving a tapestry of forgotten secrets. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp history. The corridor turned and twisted, shadows deepening until the silence broke, not with Anna's voice, but a cacophony of anguished whispers and metallic groans, the voices of past souls tethered to this place beyond time. In the dim light of my phone, I glimpsed her. Anna stood, facing away, her form faint around the edges as if phasing between worlds. Tentatively, yet desperately, I reached out, but her image flickered like a dying bulb, a tender agony in her gaze, the knowledge of a sister forever out of reach yet forever entwined with this place. My heart broke in that eternal instant when everything shattered into tumultuous dark. I awoke at the edge of town as if cast out, the sun bearing down with harsh clarity that crushed any lingering dreamscape. Behind me, the town lay untouched by the passing hours, still holding secrets more profound than the gnarled histories I'd uncovered. They were anecdotal displays, leaving Eldridge Falls unmarked, a place that didn't exist yet persistently lingered in the shadow realm of memory. I never found Anna's physical presence again, but her soft gaze haunted the edges of my perception, in every shadow cast and every whisper caught on the wind. Her disappearance was outshone by the more pressing reality, that I survived the place, marked by truths untold, deeper than any plausible fiction. I understood now, some absences permeate existence more intensely than presence. I left Eldridge Falls behind, but it never truly let go of me. My sister was gone, lost in a town that doesn't exist, yet never completely erased from reality. I never thought asking a simple question could send my life spiraling into a nightmare, but here we are. It all started when I matched with a guy named Lucas on a dating app. He was charming and witty, and for weeks, we exchanged flirty texts and memes that had me blushing like a schoolgirl. One evening, after a particularly funny exchange about our mutual love for true crime podcasts, I decided to ask him where he was from, thinking it was a harmless way to learn more about him. What happened next still feels like a scene from a horror movie. Instead of the playful banter I was expecting, he went quiet, and when he finally replied, his message was alarming. "Why do you want to know?" I chalked it up to his quirks or perhaps a little dark humor, so I made a joke about him making it sound like I was some sort of detective. But in true detective fashion, curiosity gnawed at me. I pressed a little harder, casually bringing it up in our next conversation, but he dodged the question. Just as I was about to back off, he said something that made my stomach drop. "Some places are better left unspoken." At that moment, a chill ran through me, and I set my phone down, convinced my imagination was just running wild. The next day was much the same. We chatted about everything but his hometown, and it almost felt like he was hiding something, but I shrugged it off. There are plenty of good reasons someone wouldn't want to disclose their background. Yet over the following days, the feeling of unease grew. I shared my unease with my best friend, Sarah, who only raised her eyebrows and teased me about being in too deep. But then, something even stranger happened. Lucas sent me a picture of himself, but while he looked the same, the shadows in the background seemed wrong. The trees were way too crooked, and there was a faint, almost eerie mist swirling at the ground, like something out of a horror movie. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake it off completely. I confronted him about the picture when he next texted, and his reply was easygoing, but he ended with, "You really shouldn't ask where I'm from." I felt an urgent need to know what this mystery was about. Fueled by a mix of irrationality and intrigue, I began digging deeper. I jumped on Google, searching for his name. At first, I was met with the usual social media profiles, but then I stumbled upon an article from a small-town newspaper about a tragic disappearance that happened over a decade ago. The name in the article matched his, and as I read, my heart sank further into my stomach. It detailed how a boy named Lucas had vanished without a trace, believed to have been taken by someone from the area, and the entire town had rallied for years to find him. A knot tightened in my chest. What did this mean? Could this really be the same person? As my mind raced, I felt like I was being watched, and each whispered noise in my apartment made me jump. I needed answers. I sent Lucas a message, trying to keep my voice light, asking if he was ever in the mood to meet up. Surprisingly, he agreed, and we settled for a nearby park. I felt a mix of excitement and dread, my heart pounding as I prepared to leave. The day of our meeting arrived, and I found myself pacing in front of the park's entrance, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity was a powerful motivator, so I took a breath and stepped into the park. The air felt heavier, the sunlight seeping through the trees seemed to fade rapidly, shadows clawing at the edges of my vision. I reached the bench where we agreed to meet, and he was already there, leaning back casually, unbothered, yet something felt off. His smile was charming at first, an ill-fitting mask, and I could barely muster the courage to talk about anything but the weather. Then, tentatively, I mentioned the article I found, my throat dry as I waited for his response. The smile slipped off his face, replaced with a chilling calmness that made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't dig into things you don't understand," he warned, but there was an unsettling laughter laced into his tone that unsettled me even more. The air shifted, and I felt like the park itself was holding its breath. I braved the question again, asking more directly where he was from. He paused for a moment, his eyes darkening in an almost sinister way, before finally speaking, each word dripping with a cold edge. "I'm from a place not everyone is meant to know about. A place you only get to visit once. If you're lucky." Panic surged through me, instinct screaming to run, but I was paralyzed, caught in his gaze. "You wanted to know, so now you do," he continued, and just like that, the pleasant smile returned to his face, making him look like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Suddenly, my phone buzzed, breaking the thick tension, and I looked down to see a message from Sarah. "I think someone's following me. Help." My heart dropped as I scanned the park, realizing how deserted it felt. The sun dipped below the horizon, and that hollow laughter echoed in my head as Lucas just sat there, his gaze locked on me, as if he were waiting for me to make my next move. The park felt alive, burdened with secrets too heavy for anyone to bear, and in that moment, I understood, I had crossed a line I couldn't come back from. I had to escape. I shot up from the bench, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I sprinted away, fearing I was running from the boy who never came home. As I dashed through the woods toward my car, the silhouettes of twisted branches loomed over me, shadows stretching to grasp at my ankles as if they wanted to pull me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right behind me, whispering softly about places meant to be left alone, places I could never hope to escape. It was a Thursday evening when the email landed in my inbox with the subject line "Exciting Opportunity." At first, it looked like just another mass recruitment spam from some marketing agency, but a quick glance caught my attention. "Join our exclusive research team to explore uncharted territories." My curiosity got the better of me. After a few clicks, I found myself reading through a meticulously crafted proposal that promised a hefty salary for participating in an experiment that investigated the psychological effects of isolation on human beings. Sounded intriguing. I needed the cash, and as an introverted grad student, the prospect of staying in a remote cabin with a few other participants didn't scare me off. A week later, I was packed and heading upstate, my heart racing with the thrill of the unknown. The cabin was supposed to be at the end of a dirt road, away from civilization, surrounded by dense woods that whispered tales of forgotten secrets. Upon arrival, I met the other participants, an overly enthusiastic historian, a stern-looking novelist, and a soft-spoken biologist whose eyes seemed to harbor untold stories. The researchers, clad in white lab coats, welcomed us and explained the guidelines, emphasizing that the first phase of the study would involve complete isolation for an entire week, during which we would document our thoughts and feelings in journals provided. That night, the cabin felt more like a prison. The windows looked out onto an endless wall of trees, painted black by the absence of moonlight. As the first few days passed, I found it increasingly difficult to shake the feeling of despair that had settled in my chest. The silence was deafening, almost sentient, as if the very air around us was alive and watching. On the fourth day, one of the researchers knocked on our door, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and fear. He told us the experiment had taken an unexpected turn, somebody had gone missing. We were told not to panic, that they would be fine, but the unease that seeped into our bones was palpable. I kept replaying the events in my head. The woods which had initially provided tranquility now felt menacing, filled with shadows that stirred when I wasn't looking. I found myself lying in bed at night, the walls seeming to close in, as strange noises echoed outside, thumps, whispers, almost like laughter. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, but dread tightened around my throat, suffocating rational thought. On the sixth night, a piercing scream shattered the silence like glass. One of the others was gone. I knew then that we were not safe. The doors were locked tight, but the urge to flee gripped me. At that moment, all pretense of calm shattered. The historian was hunched over, scribbling furiously in his journal, muttering about the truth that must be uncovered. The novelist paced back and forth, eyes darting to the windows as if expecting someone or something to break in. My heart raced as the biologist sat deep in thought, an expression of horror gradually dawning upon her face as she whispered what I had dreaded the most: "What if it's not just us?" When I dared to ask what she meant, she simply shrugged, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the threshold. Panic took hold, and I decided I had to escape, that the few remaining hours before dawn could be my only chance. I waited until everyone was asleep, slipping out through the back door, guided only by the sliver of moonlight. The forest enveloped me, a tangible entity that seemed to both cradle and suffocate me as I stumbled through the underbrush, branches clawing at my skin like desperate hands. I barely got 10 minutes away when the realization hit me. I had no idea where I was going or if I would even find my way back. Then, I heard it, hello, guttural sound that arose from behind me, followed by rapid footfalls, something stalking me through the dark. I ran, branches snapping underfoot, breath ragged in my chest. The sound grew louder, chasing me, but when I turned to face whatever horror it was, I caught the fleeting glimpse of a figure, a voice in the darkness whispering names from across the cabin, echoing in my mind, names of those who had vanished, their voices distorted and full of despair. I stumbled upon a clearing, panting, and before me lay a discarded journal. Flipping through pages, I realized it belonged to the missing historian. His last entry chilled me to the bone. They've seen the truth. The forest is alive. It knows us. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over me, and I whipped around to find the biologist standing there, eyes glazed and expression vacant. We shouldn't have come. They're collecting us, she said, her voice a haunting monotone, and in that split second, it all fell into place. The research wasn't simply a psychological experiment, we were bait, trapped in a twisted game for their amusement. My heart hammered as I made a mad dash back towards the cabin, desperate to warn the others before it was too late. But when I entered, all that met me was silence. I called out their names, my voice trembling, but only echoes replied. The journal slipped from my hands and crumpled on the floor, pages fluttering open, more than just word and ink, they were whispers of the lost. It felt as if the walls themselves leaned in, eager to listen to that final scream, a cacophony of terror rising until it coalesced with the very pulse of the forest, a realization dawning upon me. I was utterly alone, yet something lurked just beyond the flickering candlelight. My mind raced, caught between the walls of a tale scripted long before I arrived, and as I gathered my resolve, I understood, I had stepped into a story that had no end, trapped within pages that would only bind me tighter as I plunged deeper into the horror that unfurled around me. A question echoing in silence, what the F did I just get myself into? Growing up, I always felt different, but it wasn't until my late 20s, during a mundane appointment for a routine checkup, that the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. My doctor casually mentioned the possibility of high-functioning autism and ADHD, suggesting I explore the path to a diagnosis, yet little did I know, this was just the beginning of uncovering a darker side to my existence that nobody talks about, and as I dove deeper into understanding my mind, countless oddities and lesser-discussed symptoms emerged, like the way I could hyper-focus on trivial details while a conversation looped endlessly in the background, becoming an engrossing cacophony of noises that both intrigued and overwhelmed me simultaneously, or how I could sit through a meeting with my heart racing at the thought of communicating, feeling as if my words were tangled threads, slipping through my fingers just as I thought I might weave them into something coherent. But what really sent me spiraling into this dark realization was the feeling of being watched. I would often dismiss it as paranoia, just an overactive imagination, but the way shadows flickered just out of view in my peripheral vision became unmistakable, transforming every mundane outing into a source of anxiety, as the voices in my head grew louder, morphing into warnings that something was lurking, waiting to pounce on me the moment I let my guard down, and the memories of being teased as a child for my intense obsession with collecting stamps and how my laughter sounded more like a shriek still echoed in the caverns of my mind. These memories forged an inescapable link to my struggle, intensifying the sensation of disconnect from a world that seemed so effortlessly to connect with each other, while I stood on the periphery, cringing in social situations, wishing desperately to bask in that comforting glow of normalcy, yet feeling perpetually out of sync like a wrong note in a symphony. It was during a particularly stormy night that everything took a sinister turn. I was alone, wrapped in my blanket, the bright screen illuminating the suffocating darkness when my mind switched gears and began to churn with vile thoughts, the what-ifs clawing at the back of my consciousness. What if I never truly understood myself? What if there was a darker force at play, manipulating my perception of reality? I shook my head, trying to quell the thoughts spiraling into a horrifying ocean of confusion, but as I glanced at the window, lightning illuminated my bedroom, revealing a shadow, a figment of my imagination or an echo of the ever-present fear that I was no longer alone. My heart plunged into my stomach, and I was immobilized, struck with the terrible realization that the shadows were more than an illusion. They communicated in a language I could only sense and never comprehend, and as I bravely mustered the courage to drop the blanket, stepping onto the cold floor, the static noise from my brain morphed into whispers, soft, guttural sounds that seemed to wrap around me like a shroud, leaving no escape, compelling me to listen tightly to their promises and threats, and within that paralysis, I saw them, faces I had never encountered, eyes staring with an intensity that bared my soul naked before them, their mouths moving, yet I couldn't hear the words, the cacophony still drowning out any coherent thought. They beckoned towards me as I suddenly found myself transported to a maze of memories. Every time I had felt like I was watching life through a sepia-toned filter, every moment spent standing on the sidelines, invisible to those who laughed and shared. And it clicked, I remembered even the smallest details, what my mother wore when she told me to put the toys away, the depth of a friend's laugh that faded away when they stumbled upon my obsession with trains. But the images now flickered in front of these ethereal beings and seemed to morph into scenes more sinister, twisted, monstrous, feeding on my insecurities in a grotesque manner, revealing a past where my biggest fears morphed into tangible forms, and once they had my attention, the whispers crescendoed. They began to speak of the greater burdens of understanding, of how my high-functioning label meant nothing against their unyielding ambition for chaos, sensing my desire to label them as figments of anxiety. But they proved to be something else entirely, a collective consciousness, echoing through those lesser-discussed symptoms hidden in the fabric of neurodivergence. And that's when I realized I couldn't escape. It wasn't my imagination but rather a part of me, the very essence that made me the perpetual observer, the collector, the architect of a world constructed from fear, and every meeting, every social, every trigger was becoming a battleground for my sanity. Ultimately, I could no longer separate myself from them, acknowledging the truth that resonated with the unspoken reality of those like me. We are often told we're more than our labels, yet own the torment that lies within understanding at a deeper level. A realm inhabited by shadows whispering truths we won't ever share, and I sat there amidst the echoing whispers, knowing something had changed irrevocably. I may have been high-functioning, but behind that facade lay a tightly wound coil of dread, waiting to spring, a reality where I am no longer a silent observer but part of a haunting narrative that will never cease, all stemming from the moments we fail to articulate, where every subtle nuance morphs into menacing angst lurking just beneath the surface, reminding me that even when the shadows fade, their whispers remain forever entwined with my being, a story that could never truly be told in full, yet one that haunts me, urging me to share when its only purpose is to validate the silent screams of hundreds of others wielding the same invisible burden. If you're reading this, it's likely because the bizarre events of last night have left me questioning reality itself. It all began with what seemed like a mundane family dinner at my parents' house, a familiar and comforting setting where the warmth of my mother's cooking typically wrapped everyone in a cocoon of safety. We had gathered to celebrate my father's birthday, a man whose only claim to fame within our family was his obsession with perfecting his lasagna recipe, a task he considered akin to an artist creating a masterpiece. The kitchen table was set with the usual fanfare, a glinting feast of layered pasta, rich sauces, and gooey cheeses that clung to one another like secrets held between close friends. As my family chatted noisily around the table, I felt a sudden itch for something different, a spark of rebellion in an otherwise harmonious evening. I reached for the forgotten bottle of hot sauce nestled inconspicuously at the end of the table. It was an impulse, a reckless urge for spiciness to break the monotony, like that tingling desire for a thrill to disrupt a peaceful night's sleep. As I dabbed that fiery elixir onto my slice, I was blissfully unaware that my small act of culinary rebellion would open a door to something far beyond human comprehension. At first, the room seemed to continue as it always had, filled with the lilting tunes of conversation and laughter echoing against the walls. But as I took the first bite, the spice tingled against my taste buds with a pleasurable intensity that was almost narcotic. That euphoric moment lasted only seconds before the atmosphere around me shifted, like a scene in a play where the actors forget their lines. My family's voices drained away into a distant hum, like a radio losing signal, and the room began to stretch and twist around me, pulsating with shadows that flickered in rhythm with my escalating anxiety. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, a rhythmic drum marking the entrance of a creeping dread that clawed its way up from the pit of my stomach. My father's usual jovial face now seemed to hang on his skull like the ill-fitting mask of a stranger, and as I glanced at the other end of the long dining table, where I expected to see my sister's cheeky grin, an overwhelming darkness loomed instead, a void where her familiar presence used to radiate warmth. Concealed within that void was a whisper, an incomprehensible murmur that rasped with the urgency of a forgotten nightmare. It spoke in a language my conscious mind couldn't decode, yet my soul understood perfectly, translating the chills that danced across my spine into a primal panic I couldn't shake. I turned, desperately seeking allies in this surreal battle against the unseen. Yet when my eyes fell upon my parents and siblings, they were locked in place, eyes unblinking and vacant, as if they'd been pitched into a trance. I was alone in a room of statues, eerie replicas of my family, and from within those glassy eyes radiated an inexplicable awareness, an understanding that they were part of something I couldn't perceive, a dark reality lurking just beneath the veneer of my existence. Suddenly, I rose from my seat, driven by a primal instinct to flee but simultaneously chained by the irrational belief that leaving would condemn me to a fate I was not ready to comprehend. My eyes darted back to the plate of lasagna now turned cold and daunting, an artifact from the reality I had so thoughtlessly left behind with one impulsive act. And then came the laughter, not the mirthful sound of joyous celebration, but a guttural, echoing cackle that seemed to bubble up from deep within the earth itself. It reverberated through the walls, shaking the family photos until they hung askew, and with each laugh, the shadows in the room grew bolder, more tactile in their malice. They danced around me, taunting silently in a ballet of darkness that told me nothing and everything all at once. Was this madness a punishment for my culinary indifference, or was the universality of hot sauce simply an awakening, an unsealing of doors meant to remain shut tight? I staggered back from the table, my retreat halted only by the chill of the wall against my back as I sank onto the floor, hands pressing against my temples in a futile attempt to block out the resounding madness. But it was not until a hand, one lifelessly cold and unexpected, grasped my shoulder with an unforgiving strength that I realized I wasn't alone in my terror. A presence loomed behind me, indistinct yet real, its breath freezing the air upon my neck, whispering a mockery of existence itself as the real words it spoke slipped beyond my grasp like water through clenched fists. "Do you see now?" It whispered, each syllable a serrated edge slicing through my sanity. "Do you see the truth of what you dared to taste?" I dared not answer, could not breathe under the weight of its ancient, unfathomable malice. With a final surge of defiance, I twisted away, breaking free from its grip only to find myself back at the table, surrounded again by the pretense of family and comfort. They were talking as if nothing had occurred, as if reality had snapped seamlessly back into place, a twisted reminder that perhaps I had never left it. I stared numbly down at the heap of lasagna on my plate, the hot sauce now entirely absorbed into its folds, hinting at no evidence of the supernatural calamity it had unleashed. My family resumed their chatter, unaware of the dim specter of terror that had passed through our lives like an undetected virus. But within me lingered a dread I could neither shake nor explain, a seed of doubt in the fabric of what was real. Desperate, I shoved the lasagna away, the lingering smell of heat and spice curdling in my nostrils as I wondered if I'd summoned something that would never quite release its hold. I knew then that my life would never slip back into the comforting monotony I craved, that every echoing laugh and flickering shadow would forever carry the weight of that unspeakable presence. And as I bid my family goodbye, driving home through the night, I could almost see its eyes in the shadows cast by the streetlights, hear its insidious whisper in the rustling trees, reminding me that I can never escape what I'd tasted, annihilation sealed by the simple dip of lasagna into hot sauce. It was just another Saturday evening, and the craving for greasy, cheesy goodness crept over me like a comforting, yet unshakable presence. The neighborhood pizza joint, Tony's Slice of Heaven, was renowned for its Chicago-style deep dish pizzas, and I'd been salivating over the idea of their signature creation all week. At 7 p.m. sharp, I made the call. "Large deep dish, extra cheese, loads of pepperoni," I said, hearing the boredom in the kid's voice who took my order. His monotone confirmation and estimated time for delivery seemed off, 45 minutes instead of 15, suspicious for a place 5 minutes down the road. Time dragged heavily as I waited, stomach growling, mind daydreaming about the perfect blend of flavors and textures. The delivery was late, of course, an hour and a half late. It's hard to express the kind of hunger rage you develop when you start at very hungry and end up starving while just waiting. When the doorbell finally rang, I didn't care to check the peephole, assuming it was the teenage delivery driver, apologies rehearsed and payment calculator ready. Instead, I opened the door to a void of silence with no one in sight, until a box was slowly pushed through the entrance. At first, I thought it was a prank until I noticed a dank smell wafting from the dark hall. It didn't smell like food, more like wet earth. Phone flashlight in hand, I peeked into the hallway. No one. My building's corridor was empty, the lights flickering as if protesting their exposure to someone, or something, unexpected. I quickly closed the door, rationalizing it was just a joke, after all, a tired delivery boy pulling a fast one on hangry customers. Immersed in pizza fantasy, I returned to the box, opened it, and recoiled at the sight. The pizza was there, kind of. It seemed raw and lived in, bearing an odd consistency that could only be credited to neglect or sabotage. There, right in the middle of the coagulated cheese, sprawled a peculiar symbol etched in marinara, like some cryptic calling card. I tried to look closer, neglecting my initial revulsion. I should have known better. Each string of cheese lifted, each bite taken, felt off, otherworldly. It coated my insides with a queasiness that wasn't purely physical. Ignoring my instincts, I kept eating, hating myself and loving every illicit bite. Minutes later, a sharp knock interrupted my meal. It was a man, sweating, eyes wide open as if they'd seen too much. "You didn't pay," he panted. "You ordered, but you forgot." I fumbled incoherently for an apology and a tip out of habit, thrusting a handful of change at him. Oddly, a single nickel and 5 pennies were jammed into my palm. It felt innumerably rude and disproportionate for a $70 bill. His eyes, dark and sunken, peered into mine, devoid of forgiving, just two vast, emotionless pits. He accepted the coins and left, grumbling words I couldn't comprehend but felt immediately fearful of. As soon as he staggered out of my line of sight, the walls creaked, the shadows stretched ominously, and a pressure built in my chest like something wanted out. Then the apartment was cold, Dallas midsummer kind of cold, and I shivered uncontrollably. I thought I heard scratching, subtle at first, almost blending with the wind that crept through the cracks of the old walls, but soon it became a cacophony of skittering, clawing against imagined surfaces. The walls seemed to breathe in rhythm with my escalating panic. Before long, whispers echoed from the corners, guttural and foreign, taunting me in dialects I couldn't marry to earth. Was it the pizza? Something buried deep bobbed to the surface, a clip from a late-night paranormal show about symbols, demonic omens, and possession. No, it couldn't be that. I, a tired bachelor of minimal ambition and maximum sloth, didn't dabble in the arcane. My life was defined by meals like these, nights like this, normal, mundane. But something was wrong. The reflection in the window wasn't me, its grin too broad, skin too pallid. The world outside was undergoing transformations I couldn't account for. I swear the air got thick with the taste of pepperoni and malice. I was overwhelmed by an outrageous sense of danger, as if some pizza-related grievance awoke an ancient malevolence now seeking compensation I couldn't afford. Numbed by unimaginable paranoia, I dared not sleep. Instead, I sat, the half-eaten slice of pizza mocking me from the box like a guilty trap. It felt like a war against self-inflicted madness, my mind weaving tales of guilt and apocalypse over a neglected tip. I spent the rest of the night huddled, eyeing the doorway, waiting for the world to resolve itself, convinced that any moment, the Shadow Man would return, claiming debts unpaid, a soul's return in kind for a 10-cent tip. I'm not sure how to start this, so I guess I'll just dive in. My name is Jesse, and I've been deeply obsessed with my newfound transformation that I can hardly recognize myself. In fact, I'm slowly becoming a skinwalker, and the thought exhilarates me, though I understand that my excitement borders on madness. It started innocently enough, fueled by my late-night browsing of folklore on that dreaded corner of the internet where legends come alive, and each click brought me deeper into the lore of shape-shifting beings, both feared and revered. I stumbled upon a late-night forum discussing rituals and practices that promised the gift of transformation, a way to shed my skin and take on the powerful essence of something ancient, something primal, and for reasons I can't begin to explain, I felt a magnetic pull toward it. I was once an ordinary girl locked in a cubicle job, a mind-numbing grind of spreadsheets and customer complaints, but when I began dabbling in these dark arts, my life took a turn that still makes my heart race whenever I recollect it. The first step was simple, a blood offering, which at the time felt like a thrill, more like a rite of passage than a dangerous gamble, and I remember sitting cross-legged in my dimly lit apartment, the flickering flame from the candle casting long shadows on the walls as I pricked my finger and let a few drops fall into a small bowl, mixing it with earth from my backyard, thinking of nothing but freedom from my boring existence. I chanted the words I found online, feeling foolish and exhilarated, and it wasn't long after that my life began to shift. At first, it was subtle, little changes in my appetite, wild cravings that couldn't be ignored, an overwhelming urge to run, to feel the breeze against my skin at unnatural hours, exploring the secluded woods behind my home as if the trees were whispering secrets meant only for me. I felt a connection to the night I had never known before, and with each venture, my senses began to sharpen. I could hear the rustle of small creatures hidden under brush, the faintest scent of moss and damp earth, which was intoxicating in a way that wrapped me in comfort. The people around me started to notice. My coworkers mentioned I looked different, more alive, vibrant, as if I had shed my old skin and they could see the flourishing spirit inside. Yet, the moment I caught my reflection, I only saw hints of the person I once was, an inkling of the old Jessie laughing nervously at the thought of witches and monsters from children's stories. I longed to try the next part of the ritual, driven by an insatiable desire to fully embrace this wild version of myself. I found an old clearing where I could gather under the full moon, surrounded by ancient trees that felt like guardians of secrets untold, where they spoke in soft whispers and shadows danced in the moonlight, guiding me towards deeper realms. As I continued following the breadcrumbs of online lore, the rituals became darker, each demanding greater sacrifices, an animal's life, the spirit of someone who wronged me, and the more I became entangled in the mystery of skinwalking, the less I cared about ethical dilemmas or morals. One foggy night, I sat beneath that overcast sky, the moon obscured by clouds, my heart thrumming in my chest like it wanted to escape, when I made the ultimate pledge not just to don the flesh of beasts but to become one. It was exhilarating yet terrifying, a tug-of-war between two worlds. Closer to midnight, I carved symbols into the earth, chanting ancient tongues that rolled off my tongue like honey, sweet and sticky, numbing me from the horrors I was calling forth, and at that moment, something deep inside awoke, a feral instinct pushed to the surface, transforming my very essence. I could feel the earth thrumming beneath me, vibrating with energy that coursed through my veins, wrapping tighter around me like a cocoon. Days turned into nights, and with each cycle, I felt closer to shedding my human form, reveling in the fluidity of my being. During daylight, I would sometimes falter, but by nightfall, I was free, ignoring the calls of my friends who worried about my disappearance on weekends, how they didn't see me, and I let their worried tones fade into the background like a distant echo as it all felt so trivial. Trapped in human confines, people had begun to slip away from my thoughts, replaced by the silhouettes of wild creatures dancing in the margins of my sanity. I opened myself up to the things that crawled in corners of my mind, the restless spirits of those who had come before me, their whispers urging me forth, and before long, the lines of reality began to blur. I could feel every heartbeat, the pulse of life flowing around me, and in moments of enchanting clarity, I would be filled with desire, longing to hunt, to taste the life that pulsed just beyond my reach. I remember one night in particular, swirling with revelation, as I prowled through the trees, limbs stretched wide and heart racing, I caught the scent of something familiar, something delicious and warm, and soon I was racing under the cloak of darkness, feeling my muscles stretch and elongate, soon blissfully aware that I was no longer just a girl who had drowned in the mundane but a fierce creature of the night, and as the moon broke through the clouds and shone down on me like a spotlight, I leapt through the underbrush, a growl escaping from my throat like a long-lost song. Hunting felt almost euphoric, each pulse of prey igniting my blood. I was free in ways I never knew I could be, and with it came a bloodlust that was intoxicating, bending me towards the thrill of the chase, a mesmerizing dance that I needed to play again and again. But there's a catch, isn't there? As thrilling as this transformation was, I began to notice that each time I returned to my human form, a part of me would cling desperately to that other side, and in the mirror, changes appeared. My eyes seemed to glint with predatory delight, teeth sharper than before, the burn of something ancient igniting a spark of recognition deep down, and I could feel something slipping away within me, as if each hunt bridged the two worlds, slowly eating away at my humanity. As the nights continued, I came to a haunting realization: the skinwalker lifestyle came at a cost. One evening, I found myself staring into the mirror, horrified and enthralled at my reflection, realizing that I wasn't always going to make it back home in one piece. I felt wholly alive and yet increasingly aware that I might lose myself entirely in this wildness, and thoughts of my old life haunted me still, the one with friends who called in concern and family who still loved me for the girl I once was. I had crossed a threshold beyond return, and a primal fear began clawing at the edges of my mind, urging me to remember what it means to be human, but the intoxicating lure of the hunt kept pulling me back. In those enticing moments, it felt like freedom, each leap and growl filled with adrenaline as wild hair whipped behind me like a banner of my new identity. Tonight, as I type this, I stand at the precipice of decision. I'm no longer sure who I am, who I was, or what I'm becoming, and while the siren call of the hunt beckons me with sultry whispers, I can't help but wonder if in tomorrow's moonlight, I'll be nothing but a distant memory, replaced by the skinwalker who has claimed my soul, and if that will indeed be my true happiness. So, dear reader, if you ever find my name on the wind or feel eyes watching you from the shadows, remember this: every thrill has a price, and becoming everything I dared to dream comes at the risk of losing everything I ever was. When I first saw the peephole, it was just a small circle in the ceiling above my bed, its edges dark with the grime of years, almost as if it had been carved into the wood and left to rot with time. It was late, The kind of light that drapes an oppressive quiet over everything, and I was tossing and turning, trying to shake off the night terrors that had plagued my dreams since my grandmother passed away. I rolled over, and that's when the light from my bedside lamp caught something glinting in the hole, something wet, like an eye. I froze, heart pounding, thinking it must be a trick of sleep-addled vision, but as I squinted upwards, I felt a chill sweep through my body. The eye was gone, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. At first, the peephole seemed harmless, like an odd artifact left over from the last tenant's bizarre renovations, but the feeling of dread settled in my stomach like a stone. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that maybe it was a figment of my overactive imagination. But it gnawed at me, an incessant need to know what was on the other side, that I could not ignore. The next day, I climbed onto my bed and pressed my face to the ceiling, almost whispering a question to that void above. Were they there? But there was no answer. A week passed, and the feeling of being observed grew. I found myself checking the ceiling whenever I walked into the room, expecting the peephole to morph into something sinister. Nights became a war of wills. I slept with the light on, clutching pepper spray and a baseball bat, ready to fight against the unseen watcher. I awoke each night, drenched in sweat and fear, convinced I could see the outline of a shadow lurking in the circle, as if whatever was hiding behind it was more than just a voyeur but a predator waiting for its chance. The dread seeped into every moment of my life. I couldn't eat, and I couldn't socialize, and even work became a challenge with a fog of panic clouding my mind. My co-workers noticed, of course. They dimmed their chatter when I walked in, and I caught whispers of concern, but no one seemed to understand that I was slowly losing my grip. Eventually, I found myself spiraling down an obsessive path, and one night, in a moment of sheer desperation, I decided to confront the source. I climbed onto my bed, a flashlight in hand, and aimed it at the peephole, determined to catch sight of whatever monster it was that had tormented me for so long. I counted to 3, drew in a breath, and shone the light. My breath caught in my throat. There wasn't just darkness on the other side. Behind the peephole was something that looked very much like a face, pale and featureless except for a mouth that twisted in a grotesque smile. It was like looking at a reflection distorted by fear itself. My instinct was to scream, but I managed to choke it back down, instinct kicking in to fly, but my body was rooted in icy terror. Instead, I blinked, thinking I had imagined it, but when I opened my eyes, that hideous grin was still there, as if waiting for me to move or falter. I stumbled back from my bed, fearing that whatever was on the other side would try to crawl through, somehow reach me, but it didn't. It just stayed there, unmoving, watching as I hastily packed a bag with the essentials. As dawn broke, I fled, abandoning my home, and didn't stop running until I hit the nearest motel. It took me months of therapy to untangle the darkness that had taken root in my mind. I tried to convince myself that the peephole was a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of grief and anxiety, but sometimes late at night when I'd lie in bed, the darkness swallowing me whole, I still felt a pair of eyes boring into my soul, and I would glance at the ceiling to check for that hole. But as my therapist suggested the concept of exposure therapy, I thought it ludicrous until one night I sat in a chair beneath the glaring fluorescent lights, the weight of my fears pressing down on my shoulders like a leaden shroud. I decided to face my enemy once and for all, and so, armed with a drill and a stack of ambition, I drove back to that cursed apartment, trembling hands gripping the tools of confrontation. I managed to unlock the door on my first try and took a reluctant step inside, heart racing. With every step towards that bedroom, I could feel the air thickening, but curiosity propelled me forward, more powerful than the fear that clung to my throat. I stood under the peephole again, its mouth still open and inviting as if I were the only one who could hear its siren song. I breathed deeply, focused all my strength, and tackled it with my drill, the screeching sound mingling with adrenaline. When the biting wood chips began to fall, I felt an odd mix of triumph and terror. The peephole wasn't just a hole, it was an eye into something I never wanted to see. Just as I was about to start disassembling it from my ceiling, a voice broke the silence, soft and eerie. "Please, don't do that. You'll regret it." I turned to find a figure standing in the doorway, my own reflection staring back at me, an uncanny sadness nestled within its gaze. "You should have left it be," it said, a harsh whisper that stung like ice water. "It was better when you didn't know." I stumbled back, dropping the drill, confusion lacing my breath. As I blinked again, the figure morphed into a silhouette, slowly merging with the darkness surrounding it, a knowing smile creeping on its lips as it whispered, "You've always known." Suddenly, the peephole widened, and the grinning visage I had once feared now looked familiar and unsettling, reflecting pieces of me I didn't want to face, an endless loop of my waking nightmares, the despair I tried to escape, now trapped within the confines of a wooden frame. The once small peephole unfurled into a vision of my own fraying sanity laid bare, and I realized with a sickening twist of understanding that the true horror wasn't merely someone watching, it was me, always watching, feeling helpless in my own mind, and waiting for it to devour me whole. And then, with a blinding flash, I could hear them all, the whispers, the faint echoes returning, "You can't leave. You've let us in." That's the last thing I remember before everything went dark, and I woke up again, this time feeling the cold, familiar weight of my bed holding me down, still staring up at that damn peephole in the ceiling, and I couldn't help but wonder, maybe this time, it wasn't just someone who'd been watching. Maybe this time, I was the one being watched from within. I need to start by saying I never believed in curses or anything supernatural, but if my experience has taught me anything, it's that some things are better left unexplored. A couple of months ago, during a yard sale spree with my friend Jason, we stumbled upon an intriguing item, a wooden box, covered in intricate carvings with symbols neither of us recognized. The old man selling it claimed it was a dybbuk box, and laughed off our questions, saying it was for curious minds. Jason challenged me to buy it as a joke, but I decided to take the plunge. I wish I hadn't. When I got home, the air inside my apartment felt heavier, but I brushed it off as fatigue. That evening, out of sheer boredom, I decided to open the box. Inside, I found strange trinkets, a rusty key, a lock of hair, and a small parchment paper with Hebrew writing. I'm not sure what compelled me to, but I whispered the words written on the parchment out loud. That's when everything started going downhill. The first sign was mild, a series of terrible nightmares, ones where I was running through endless corridors as unseen entities laughed in the shadows. I shrugged them off as a product of stress until I heard my mom had a freak accident the next day. She slipped down the stairs and ended up with a severe head injury. I tried to rationalize it, yet my gut twisted with an odd sense of dread. It was just the beginning. The following week, my sister's fiancé was struck by a car. The tragedy seemed unwarranted, as he was always so careful. My family was starting to fray at the edges, snapping at each other out of grief and despair. I couldn't push aside the connection between the box and these horrors. Jason scoffed at my concern, telling me I was going insane, until a raging fire broke out in his apartment from a mysterious electrical fault. He's now in a hospital with second-degree burns. My heart sank deeper into an abyss of guilt with each devastating phone call. My paranoia escalated when I heard whispers in my own apartment, wordless at first, but soon I began discerning voices calling my name. I barricaded the box in the attic, but the sinister energy seeped into every crevice of my life. Searching for answers, I dove into cryptic forums and old texts, desperate for a solution. One late night, I came across a post by a rabbi who spoke of the risks of opening a dybbuk box, warning of malevolent entities that cling to the living, feasting on their suffering. Hemmed in by despair, I finally reached out to him. During our call, he instructed me on how to cleanse the box. I needed a mix of salt and sage and had to recite a protective incantation. In a frenzy, I assembled the materials. When I was ready, I climbed to the attic, each step echoing with a foreboding hum. The air was thick with something that felt alive, watching. My spine tingled as I began the incantation. I felt a chill rising through the room, shadows swirling along the walls, the whispers reaching a crescendo. The candles flickered, and just as I was about to lose hope, the box snapped shut with a horrid finality, the air suddenly clear. I stumbled back, drenched in sweat and tears. An overwhelming sense of relief washed over me, but I knew the damage was irreversible. The rabbi assured me over a cracked voice call that the entity was sealed back in. The accidents mysteriously halted, the oppressive aura lifting from my family's shoulders. But I'm haunted every single day by the faces of my loved ones, those still suffering from scars that won't heal, and the memory of Jason's burned skin. I never dared to touch the box again. It lies buried in a cursed spot known only to me, under heavy stones somewhere far from humanity's reach. Consider this a cautionary tale, some histories should remain untouched. If you ever encounter a dybbuk box, I beg you, leave it be. For your own sake, and for everyone you hold dear. The night air clung to every surface like cold, clammy fingers, an oppressive presence that had become all too familiar in our quiet suburb. My husband and I had moved into this idyllic neighborhood a few years back, hoping to find some tranquility after the chaos that had characterized much of our lives up to that point. Little did we know, tranquility was a fleeting fantasy. It all started when my mother-in-law, Patricia, and my brother-in-law, Jake, showed up on our doorstep late one October evening, a pale and weary desperation etched across their faces. Their story was one of hardship, a series of unfortunate events that left them homeless, living out of their beaten-up station wagon. Soft-hearted as my husband is, he immediately invited them to stay, albeit in the car, assuring them they could use our bathroom and kitchen as needed. I hesitated but eventually agreed, reasoning with myself that family was family. At first, things seemed manageable. They were quiet, unobtrusive, sticking mostly to their vehicle. Occasionally, they'd shuffle inside, eyes downcast, hoping to avoid confrontation, or perhaps avoid raising my suspicions. But inevitably, the peace shattered like splintering glass. As days turned into weeks, strange occurrences began to bleed into our daily life. We'd wake up to fingernail marks scratched into the hood of our cars, Patricia babbling incoherently about protecting the family. Inside the house, I began to notice things out of place, drawers slightly ajar, a whiff of Jake's cologne where I hadn't seen him. The final straw landed with a heavy thud when I woke up one morning to find symbols, bizarre and intricate, etched beneath our windowsills and what looked and smelt like old blood. My husband brushed it off as some kind of prank, but I knew better. Over dinner, I confronted them, asking about the symbols, the disturbances, the eerie sounds echoing late at night. Jake only muttered something about keeping the spirits at bay while Patricia whispered apologies amidst fragmented tales of nightmares chasing them since they left their last home. It was past sundown after I delivered the ultimatum. They needed to leave. A primal fear clawed at me, an instinct that warned of encroaching danger. As they packed their few belongings, the air seemed to buzz, like static before a storm. My husband, torn between empathy and unease, tried to reason with me, but standing firm, I watched them depart, their car swallowed by the shadows that seemed unnaturally eager to embrace them. Sleep eluded me that night, haunted by unsettling dreams of eyes watching from dark corners, whispers creating melodies of madness. A thumping sound woke me, rhythmic and unyielding, coming from the driveway. Peering through the curtains, the sight made my blood congeal. The car was back, rocking aggressively, windows fogged, interior lights flickering on and off like a strobe nightmare. I shook my husband awake, pulling him to the window. As his eyes widened in disbelief, Jake's face appeared, pressed against the glass with a frantic yet vacant look, mouthing words that didn't align with the movement of his lips. I barely registered my husband's steps retreating behind me when the car door swung open, Patricia fighting against something unseen, her cries merging with the snarls of Jake as he lunged forward, only to be yanked back by invisible bindings. The driveway seemed to devour all sound save their tortured wails. I remember dashing outside in a haze, maybe hoping to help, maybe hoping to understand, but all thoughts fell away as I reached out to open the door. The metal scorched my hand like an iron brand. I stumbled back, the temperature around us plummeting as frost crept over the asphalt. Patricia screamed, a sound accompanied by the sickly sweet scent of something burning. Panicked, I pulled my husband back indoors, slamming the door behind us. He was already on the phone, muttering incoherently to emergency services. By the time they arrived, there was nothing but silence, echoes of torment hanging in the air. The car stood emptied, untouched since that frozen encounter, and within it, not a trace of Patricia or Jake. They vanished as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only those ominous symbols I'd seen once under our windows, now carved into the wood of our own front door. We moved away soon after, the neighborhood casting us suspicious glances, some thought us cold-hearted, others mad, but I knew differently. We had survived whatever malignancy had rooted itself in that car, and at night I still hear Patricia's fragmented warnings in the whispers of the wind, pleading for us to remember that some spirits do indeed board vehicles and that the road less traveled often leads to nightmares walking in daylight shadows. I've always heard people say that being attractive opens doors, but they never warned me about the horrors it could also unleash. I was the girl in my high school who everyone thought was just another pretty face, my long hair and sparkling blue eyes earning me compliments and envy in equal measure. Once I graduated, I moved to a big city, where I thought my looks would finally bring the good life I had dreamed of. But what they never mention is the hell it can bring. It started subtly, with strangers approaching me, their eyes filled with something that could only be described as a mixture of desire and desperation, but it escalated quickly. At first, it was flattering. I received a free drink here, a ticket to an event there, until the attention morphed into something unsettling. I remember that night vividly. I was at a rooftop bar when a group of men, well-built and boisterous, surrounded me, their laughter turning into a predatory glare when I politely declined their invitations to join them. It was just a game to them. The thrill of the chase, they thought, was theirs for the taking. I should have left then, But that's when I spotted him, a tall, dark-haired man with piercing green eyes, smiling at me from across the bar. An almost magnetic pull drew me in, and before long, I found myself swaying to the music beside him. We talked and laughed, my spirits lifting until I felt blissfully safe, until he leaned in and whispered in my ear, a dangerous smile creeping onto his face. The lightheartedness of the night shattered as he told me he could see my true nature, that he knew I enjoyed the attention, that I wanted to play with their hearts, but deep inside I was just as empty as they were. The air thickened with tension, the laughter around me sounded like echoes of some dark truth, and I suddenly felt trapped in a bubble that only he could burst. I laughed it off, trying to regain my composure, but the shadows in his gaze grew darker, and I could feel the room spin around me too quickly. Panic set in as I realized that those men, those predators, were no longer just irrelevant strangers, they were now hungry wolves scenting their prey in a darkening forest, and my charming savior had transformed into my worst nightmare. I excused myself, my heart pounding, but he grasped my wrist, holding me in place with a strength that caught me off guard. I pulled away, and he laughed, the sound mirroring the laughter from earlier, but now it was sinister, laced with something dangerously unpredictable. I broke free and bolted for the door, my mind racing with thoughts of escape, but no matter how fast I moved, it felt as though every set of eyes in that bar was watching me like a hawk. I burst onto the street, my heart hammering, fists tightening around my phone, ready to call for help. My phone slipped from my clammy hands and clattered to the ground, shattering the screen. I cursed under my breath as I fumbled to pick it up, only to realize he was right behind me, a sinister grin stretching across his face. "You can't run from who you are," he said, his voice low and chilly, echoing my deepest fears. I sprinted down the street, weaving through the crowds, tearing past oblivious partygoers who laughed and drank, unable to see the predator stalking just behind me. The city skyline blurred as I fled, my lungs burning with every step, but his presence lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I ducked into an alley, hoping it would offer safety, but as I pressed my back against the cold brick wall, he was there, leaning against the corner, as if he had simply stepped out of the shadows. "I just needed you to understand," he said, taking a single step forward. My mind raced, replaying every time I felt objectified, reduced to nothing more than a pretty face, and I suddenly realized he wasn't just a man but a personification of the madness that swirled around me. "You see, people want to take you, to make you theirs, but you're not a prize to be won," I shouted, fear mixing with anger. He chuckled, and it sent chills down my spine. "And yet, they can't resist, can they? You attract vultures like moths to flame. Everything you are is a weapon, and they'll do anything to possess it." My heart raced as my thoughts spiraled. Was he mirroring my nightmares or living them out? I turned to run again, but he grabbed my arm, holding me tightly in place, the grip almost painful. The noise of the city faded, the reality of our exchange wrapping around me like a heavy fog. "It's all a game, my darling, and you're winning. But every game has a cost, and other players don't like to lose." I jerked away, adrenaline pumping through my veins. "Let me go. This isn't a game." But the more I struggled, the stronger his hold became, until finally, with a last, desperate twist, I broke free and ran to the main street, gasping for help, for anyone to save me from the delusions this man spun. Just as I turned to look back, he had vanished like smoke, leaving only a lingering chill that clung to my skin. I never saw his face again after that night. I didn't want to. The attention didn't stop, if anything, it intensified. I became a mere ghost of my former self, a decorative portrait hanging on the wall of a gallery where no one sees beyond the frame. I withdrew from social life, but even in isolation, I could hear faint whispers, taunts echoing in the silence, reminders of what I had survived, and why looks can trap you just as tightly as they can attract. What they don't tell you is that beauty is as much a curse as it is a blessing when the eyes that find you alluring belong to wolves in sheep's clothing. It started a few weeks ago, the unease gnawing at my gut every time I walked down Culver Street. I couldn't explain it at first, but as the days rolled into weeks, the feeling snowballed from mild discomfort to unshakable dread. I had just moved to town and was getting used to my new surroundings when I first noticed the trash bins. You know, the big, green ones that line the curb every few feet in any neighborhood? Except on Culver Street, they were always empty, always. I've got a dog, a scruffy little terrier named Max, and our walks down that block became a point of obsession for me. Each afternoon as we made our way past the rows of crisp, clean trash bins, I began to hold my breath, looking for any sign of refuse, any remnants of life daring to touch the stillness, but nothing ever changed, It was as though a giant vacuum existed, sucking away any waste before it had the chance to settle. I tried asking my neighbors about it, hoping for a laugh or at least some offbeat explanation, but they all responded with wide eyes and tight lips, as if I had asked them about a dark secret, shaking their heads slowly and whispering worriedly that it was best not to think about it. That's when my imagination took the wheel. Every time I walked past those empty bins, I pictured frenzied scenes of something sinister lurking just out of sight, drawing everything in and then feasting, maybe something as mundane as a family of raccoons at midnight, or maybe something that belonged to the stories we whisper around campfires, something that wanted to keep the street free of clutter as it maintained its hunger. A few sleepless nights later, craving answers like a drug, I decided to venture out at dusk. The sun hung low, tossing long shadows, and as I crept down Culver Street with Max on his leash, I felt the cool air drizzle over me, goosebumps dancing on my skin as I caught sight of the street lamps flickering to life. There was a heaviness in the atmosphere, a sort of smothering silence that made the hair on my arms bristle. Every few steps, I turned to glance back at the bins. They watched, still and empty, as if anticipating a visitor, and I felt their gaze pierce deep into my soul. A knot twisted in my stomach and panic began gnawing at me when I noticed that we were not alone. Shadows shifted and scuttled, inhuman shapes starting on the edge of my vision, retreating whenever I turned to confront them. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself, just my nerves, but part of me, deep down in the cavernous darkness of my mind, whispered that it wasn't just paranoia. Racing thoughts heightened my senses as I passed the last bin, bleak and vacant, like the others, and suddenly the scent hit me. For a moment, every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to drag Max back to the safety of my home, but there was something alluringly repugnant that pulled me closer, beckoning me to investigate. The air smelled of decay, the rot of something long gone, and yet, oddly, familiar. I held on to Max's leash a bit tighter, moving closer to the open lid perched precariously atop the last bin. I peered inside, squinting against the creeping dusk, and my heart stuttered in my chest when I saw it, a glint of what looked like a plastic bag, neatly folded and stuffed into the depths of the bin as if someone had placed it there with considerable care. It wrinkled, hinting at movement, and suddenly I was terrified, thinking of all the things it could contain, the horrors buried beneath the ordinary facade of a trash bin. Perhaps it was the remains of something, an animal, a person, a secret better left untouched. A desperate shiver knotted my spine, and just as I began to back away, teetering on the verge of turning tail, the ground beneath me cracked, a low, guttural sound emanating from below, vibrating right through the cracks in the pavement and into my bones. Max whimpered, stamping his paws as the dark shapes reappeared, crawling out from their sanctuary and into the light. I don't know how to describe them, not fully, perhaps like rotting puppets, limp and grotesque, their eyes glazed and hollow, drifting toward me with a chanting that sounded eerily human yet twisted beyond reason. Cold sweat pricked at my forehead, and I was frozen, paralyzed as they surrounded me, the smell of rancid meat and mold growing more overpowering with every shallow breath I took. My mind raced, I bolted, yanking Max with me as my feet finally regained their sense of urgency, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm of fight or flight. We sprinted back toward the light at the end of the street, the echoing whispers following like demons just beyond the corner of my eye. I could hear them shrieking, their voices layered with madness and hunger, taunting my escape as the last bin, the stinking, vacant bin, stood sentinel, waiting patiently for whatever was left of my sanity. I hardly slept that night, hearing the whispers creep into my dreams, taunting me with that putrid scent, and the next day I unloaded my fears onto anyone who would listen. But discouragement met me at every turn, the locals just burrowed deeper into their shells, speaking in hushed tones and darting nervous glances toward the street now feeling more like a graveyard than a neighborhood. The following night, something deep inside me crackled, my legs moved before I could consciously decide to. The temptation was too powerful, I needed to understand what was happening on Culver Street, even as my rational brain screamed for me to run. I stood once again before those sinister bins, and though darkness cloaked the immediate path, a sickening instinct drew me close. My heart was pounded erratically while I pried the heavy lid open once more, praying it was a bad dream, and then, in the edge of the faint light, I saw it, a grotesque mass, writhing and heaving, caked with grime, with eyes too many to count, swirling aimlessly. It looked like a creature formed from the very essence of nightmares, stitched together from broken bits of anguish and despair, breathing deeply as if drawing strength from the darkness, and then it hissed, a voice fueled by the weight of insatiable hunger. "You're next," it whispered, and all I could think of was how those bins, those hauntingly empty bins, were never truly empty. They existed as a hollowed-out facade, keeping their secrets tucked away for when someone like me slipped through the cracks, someone who was just curious enough to peer inside. I ran again, swallowed by the echoes of my own screams, but here's the thing, every night since, I found a new trash bin filled with plastic bags lining the curb, and when I dared glance at the contents, I saw remnants of things lost, hints of flesh and bone, of memories and lives, discarded whispers forever silenced in darkness. Culver Street's emptiness was a monster's lure, and now, my neighbors avoided me like I was the real danger, shunning the harbinger of stories yet to unfold. But I saw the truth as surely as I saw my own reflection. Those bins would always remain empty to them, but to me, they'd become a warning, a perpetual invitation to delve deeper into the secrets they housed, to join those who disappeared and to help feed its insatiable hunger. When I first started my internship at the local mental health clinic, I had no idea that my career would lead me to a patient like her, a name I can't disclose due to HIPAA, but let me tell you, it doesn't matter what I call her, I'll never forget her. It was a drizzly Tuesday when I first visited her, a timid woman who had been referred to our clinic by a concerned neighbor who cited unusual behavior. I arrived at her house, only to find it was a dilapidated old Victorian at the end of a long, unpaved road. The wind howled through the crumbling shutters, giving the impression that the house itself was trying to shout a warning. I knocked, the sound echoing louder than I expected. There was a shuffling behind the door, and a moment later, it creaked open just enough for me to see a sliver of her face, framed by unkempt hair and bloodshot eyes. You came," she muttered in a hushed tone before reluctantly letting me in. The interior was dimly lit and smelled musty, with peeling wallpaper and dusty furniture barely holding on to the remnants of its former glory. I glanced towards the staircase leading to the upper levels, but it was barricaded by a rusted gate, and that's when I noticed a door to the right, its edges warped as if it had been poorly fitted. Curiosity nodded me as I caught her stealing glances at it while fidgeting with her fingers, nails bitten down to the quick. It was through our conversation that I learned she lived alone in the basement. "It's better down there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "they can't hear me." I was instantly intrigued. I asked who they were, but she only shook her head, tears pooling in her sunken eyes. I tried to delve deeper into her story, but she withdrew, as if placing a fragile veil around her truth, isolating herself even further. Determined to break through her barriers, on my next visit I asked about the basement, and she bit her lip, hesitating before saying it was safer, warmer, more hidden. I can't let them find me." Her words sent chills down my spine, but I reminded myself that it was a classic case of paranoia, a symptom often present in patients dealing with severe anxiety or schizophrenia. Yet, every detail, every shadowy glance towards that door in the living room clawed at my professional mind. After a few more appointments, I broke down my own resolve and proposed visiting the basement. "You could feel more comfortable down there. Let's talk in your safe space," I suggested, swallowing the unease creeping up my throat. Reluctantly, she agreed. The moment we descended the rickety stairs, I felt the air grow heavy, thick with the stale scent of dampness and mildew. The basement was cavernous and dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a flickering light bulb hanging from the low ceiling, casting eerie shadows that danced on the concrete walls. In the far corner, I saw her makeshift bed, a tattered mattress strewn with stained blankets and discarded books. The walls were pinned with pages torn from magazines, all with frantic, manic scrawls in red ink outlining her fears and conspiracies, connecting dots that led nowhere. It was chaotic, a frantic map of a mind grasping at the last straws of sanity. My heart raced as she started to explain her thoughts, but I felt like I was being watched. A prickle of anxiety crawled up my spine. "They know," she whispered, eyes wide with dread. But before I could question her further, I heard it, a faint scratching noise originating from behind the wall, like nails digging into wood. My pulse quickened, and I glanced at her, expecting to see fear mirrored in her gaze, but instead, there was an unsettling calmness. "They're here," she said as if it were an everyday occurrence, her voice chillingly nonchalant. "They come during the night when I can't see them. I can hear them scratching. Want to come in?" I felt my throat tighten, a tight coil of panic unfurling in my stomach as I tried to rationalize. "It's probably just the pipes or the house settling," I attempted to soothe her, but doubt gnawed at my certainty. Then, without warning, she surged to her feet and banged her fists against the wall where the sound was emanating from, demanding, "Leave me alone. I'm not afraid of you." Anguish flooded her face, and for a moment, I forgot everything I thought I knew about her until the scratching turned into a sudden thundering knock on the other side of the wall. I stumbled back, the world tilting as panic clotted my chest. I had to remind myself that this was a woman in pain, Someone who was manifesting her paranoia through this madness, yet the absolutely bewildering fear spread through me like wildfire. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and the knocking intensified, transforming into frantic thuds that echoed around us. "Please. Let me out. You can't stay here," she screamed, her voice a mix of terror and defiance. Forcing myself to remain calm, I took a step toward her, but she shrieked, "Don't. They'll see you." The weight of her words anchored me to the spot as shadows seemed to stretch, darkening the corners of the room as if they were swallowing the light whole. Then it all became too much, something primal within me triggered a fight or flight response, and I bolted back up the stairs, fueled by a terrifying urgency to escape that dark, suffocating basement. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, only to find her crying softly, "You shouldn't have left." I didn't return to the clinic the next day, nor the week after that. I told myself it was for her sake as much as mine, she needed better care than I could provide. But truthfully, it was because I couldn't shake the bone-deep feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was right, that something in that basement wasn't just her paranoia. Days turned into weeks, and the memories of my encounters with her began to fade until, one afternoon, I saw an article online. It detailed a woman found dead in a basement, the walls plastered with strange markings and notes, her body curled beneath the stairs. The cause of death was unexplained, terrifying to think of her, alone and frightened, once again. I quickly clicked on the link and felt my stomach drop when I saw a picture of her, a familiar, hollow-eyed gaze that now stared vacantly back at me from the screen. Beneath it was a chilling quote from her neighbor stating how they heard scratching behind the walls every night she was there but assumed it was just rodents. The moment the article loaded, my phone buzzed, and I turned to see a message flash on the screen from my supervisor, "You're back." All the air whooshed out of my lungs as I read the text again. "We're getting a new patient to the clinic. You're on for the assessment. Lives in a basement." Minutes later, a familiar voice crackled down the line, a haunting echo of despair. "Please. Help me," it whispered, and suddenly I knew, I could never escape the basement. Owning a motel was never on my bucket list, but when my uncle mysteriously passed and left me the keys to the Sunset Serenity Motel, I didn't have much of a choice. I was hoping for a fresh start after a messy divorce, and somewhere halfway between Tucson and nowhere seemed perfect. My first impression was nothing special, a faded neon sign buzzing sporadically, cracked asphalt, and a lobby that smelled faintly of pine sol and desperation. But there was something oddly charming about the place, so I decided to give it a shot. The first few nights were uneventful, with barely any guests trickling in. But on the fourth night, something weird happened that still haunts me. It was around 2 a.m. when my phone rang with a reception desk call. I cursed under my breath, I hadn't heard a peep from the damn thing since I arrived. Initially, I considered ignoring it, but something about the urgency of the ringing compelled me to answer. "Room 12, the TV won't turn off, and the screen's all static," rasped a gruff voice on the other end. I tried explaining that the TV remote had its quirks, shaking it usually did the trick, but the caller cut me off, "Just get someone here," before hanging up abruptly. Reluctantly, I dragged myself out of bed, wondering why I thought running a motel was a good idea. Room 12 was at the far end of the corridor, a corner shadowed by overgrown hedges that seemed to breathe in the wind. As I approached, the air felt thick and heavy, as if pressing down on my shoulders. That's when I noticed the TV inside flickering through the curtains, a chaotic dance of black and white, like there was a struggle occurring on the screen. I knocked gently, half hoping no one would answer and this would be a quick fix. No response. I was about to leave when the door creaked open eerily, as if inviting me in. The room was engulfed in the cold glow of the TV, displaying nothing but static. The light cast eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper, and the stagnant air inside was thick with a musty smell. It looked like no one had been there for a long time, dust coated the surfaces, and the bedspread was untouched. "Hello?" I called out, feeling a chill drape over me. No response, except for the persistent hiss of the TV. A shiver of dread ran through me as I crossed the room and picked up the remote from the bed. Strangely, the power button refused to work, despite changing the batteries just the day before. Suddenly, the static morphed into images, quick, fragmented glimpses of people's faces, their expressions twisted in anguish, but gone before I could make sense of them. My heart pounded as the channels flipped on their own, a rapid fire of unnervingly clear silent screams and eyes that seemed to lock with mine as they appeared. I finally managed to rip the TV's plug from the wall. Silence swallowed the room, leaving only the echo of my ragged breathing. But there was something off, the air was colder, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. That's when I noticed it, the mirror on the wall, a slight distortion rippling across its surface, like watching a reflection in water. I stepped closer, and my breath turned to frost on the glass. Within the glass, the reflection of the room revealed not me alone, but a shadowy silhouette hovering behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My skin prickled with an ancient instinct to flee, but my feet felt glued to the spot. The hairs on my neck stood rigid, and I swear I could hear faint whispers, like a breeze that carried secrets from another world. They were incoherent at first, but slowly sharpened into discernible words. Help us. Trapped. Before I could process anything, the mirror's surface cracked with an ear-splitting shatter, sending splinters of glass skittering across the floor. I bolted from the room, not stopping until I reached the lobby and slammed the door behind me. Panting heavily, I tried to rationalize what I'd just witnessed, but reason felt like a distant ally in that moment. The rest of the night passed in a haze of adrenaline and fevered dreams, filled with ghosts that reached out from screens towards me. I woke up drenched in sweat, the memory of their cold fingers still seared into my mind. Determined to confront this, I returned to room 12 after sunrise, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the stillness. The cleaning lady, Rosa, an elderly woman with somber eyes who'd been with the motel for years, stood outside with a box of cleaning supplies. "Rosa, did you see anything strange last night?" She froze, diluting a friendly smile into a solemn nod. "This place. It holds memories," she whispered, speaking as though reciting from another's script. "Sometimes, they don't stay in the past." Rosa explained that she'd heard stories, odd occurrences plaguing room 12 for years, ominous enough that the guest ledger always showed it unoccupied despite reservations. She recounted tales of previous owners, each leaving under bizarre circumstances, some claiming to hear voices or see specters in mirrors that mimicked their movements just a beat too late. Driven by misguided bravado and a hint of curiosity, I decided to uncover the motel's history. The local record office yielded rumors of a fire decades ago that claimed lives in room 12, lingering stories of souls unable to rest, trapped in the liminal space between broadcast attire and nightly dreams. It all started to make a sick, twisted sense now, the images, the silhouettes reaching out for salvation or perhaps revenge. As I stood there, piecing together the fragmented legacy of terror, a sense of duty settled within me. The motel, the secrets it guarded, was now mine to bear. Armed with the unsettling truth, I returned to room 12 equipped with an old family heirloom, a silver locket my grandmother swore had protective properties. I whispered words of farewell, hoping to provide some measure of peace. As I placed the locket beneath the bed like an offering, there was a moment of stillness, as if the building exhaled, and then a warm light enveloped the room, softening its edges. The air grew lighter, the reflections steady and true. I stayed until I felt a strange calm. That night, the TV stayed off, and dreams, if they came, passed unnoticed. I knew this was not an ending but a temporary ceasefire, because old motels like this one never really shed their secrets, they only share them with someone who listens.